Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS week number 6 overview, analysis, and kind of some power rankings at the end of this video. Not necessarily the ones that you might be used to if you're watching my LCS videos, but let's address the elephant in the room. I did not cover week number 5. Now, I did say that I wasn't going to cover week number 5 in my week number 4 video. As you guys know, I was out of town, was away from keyboard. I wasn't able to make videos over the past week or so, and so I wasn't able to get to week number 5, but I am going to make sure that I get to week number 6 here on this channel because playoff time is here. This is the final week of the regular season in the LCS. By the end of this episode, we will know our 8 playoff teams. We will know the seeding, and we will know which 2 teams will be eliminated, not only from the summer split, but of course, because of the way LCS works, eliminated from Worlds contention. No championship points in North America. You gotta do well in summer in order to qualify for the World Championship, but I really want to know what you guys' thoughts and opinions are down below. A little bit of a disclaimer, I have updated everything that needs to be updated, which means I've gone back and I've done all of my player of the games and dud of the games from week number 5. I'm not going to go through all of them because that would be absurd, but what is worth noting is that my player of the week in week number 5 ended up going to Palafox, the mid laner of Energy. Energy in general just had a really, really good week, and it felt pretty obvious to give it to him, and my dud of the week for week number 5 ended up going to Armeo, the jungler for Evil Geniuses. They're kind of the standout players, both good and bad. Armeo, obviously, kind of getting benched this week and not playing in week number 6, and EG, you know, we'll get to that, how they looked over the course of this video, but I've updated all of that, and I've also updated the power rankings, and so if the numbers next to the teams look a little bit different than what they were last time, you know, we left off here on this channel, that's why. It's because I have updated them after week number 5, so let's go ahead and get right into it without further ado. Of course, what we do on this channel is we go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'm going to give a player of the game, a dud of the game for everything. And then at the end of the week, you know, I'll kind of do some updated power rankings, but mostly I'm going to be saving that stuff for my playoff primer, and I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week, and I'll kind of be going over the playoff format in general and just how I feel about a lot of these teams. And so if you're excited, hit that like button, let me know down below. But let's go ahead and jump right into day number 1. We might get some tiebreakers this week, so I don't want to take up too much time on this intro. It might be more than 15 games to cover. And so starting, of course, with the first game of day number 1, we had a matchup between Immortals and Evil Geniuses that Evil Geniuses is going to be able to take. Nice win for them, and you know what? They really needed this. I know Immortals hasn't exactly been very good, and that's not a huge surprise to anybody watching. Immortals is the worst team in the LCS, in my opinion. You know, they've had some back and forth moments in terms of being able to play some of the lower teams in the league, but consistency-wise, they're the one team that I trust probably the least out of anyone in the LCS, and, you know, I think that definitely continued here. We'll get into some of the things they did wrong, but EG actually had a miserable week number 5. They ended up going 0-3 across that week after looking really good at the beginning of the split. They were 9-3, tied for first or in second place, one of the two going into week number 5, and they walk out of it at 9-6, and it's like, oh, okay, never mind. This team is not one of the best in the LCS. They're not top 2, and so they fell to number 5 in my power rankings. We're going to see some big risers, I would say, some surprising risers in my power rankings when we go over it that didn't age quite well, but EG kind of getting their form back here against a much easier opponent in Immortals, so I don't want to throw out all that tape, but one thing to note, Armeo is out, Shaden is in. This is a very interesting decision from Evil Geniuses. Shaden, obviously the Evil Geniuses Challengers jungler, and, you know, he's been a crazy prospect in the NACL and in Academy for a little while. Originally came up with Cloud9. I mean, had been in the amateur scene for quite a while, and obviously was a solo queue superstar, somebody that a lot of people in solo queue knew about, but came up with Cloud9, did really well last year, came over to Evil Geniuses, and really has not had the same kind of year that I think a lot of people expected him to have, but being put in a really big situation with better players around him on, you know, the official Evil Geniuses team is certainly going to show whether or not he can play, and, you know, for his credit, he played his role really well in this game. It wasn't a big enough sample size for me to really make any sort of, you know, big statements, quite like I did with, like, APA or Eminence last split, where it was, like, immediately clear that it was a massive upgrade, but Shaden did his job really well. He allowed the rest of the players on this team to win the game for him, and that's all he really needed to do on Poppy. He wasn't exactly the biggest role player in the entire world, but he didn't have to be. He wasn't supposed to to be in this game. And so, you know, a lot of credit there, but player of the game pretty easily going to go to Revenge in the top lane. Great performance from him on the Gwen, going against his former team here. It's always good to see a player step up against an organization that maybe was kind of considered to be less than what they were. You know, Revenge was a pretty good player, and Immortals could never win with him on the roster. Not that they can win now without him on the roster or anything, but good to see Revenge get some revenge in this game, and I think he did look really good on the Gwen. JoJo, I think, was also really good on the Ahri, but man, he's just consistently so good. He's basically only had like 1 or 2 even remotely bad games throughout the entirety of the summer split. He's been the most consistent player in the LCS for my money, and I think that is absolutely carried over. I know the MVP conversation is actually going to be relatively difficult in the LCS because there are a lot of players that I think, you know, at least a baseline level do deserve it, but I think JoJo is definitely the player that a lot of people are going to go to first in terms of, you know, having their mind cast in that kind of direction, and deservedly so. Like I said, Shaden was good, Unforgiven and Ayla were fine. They didn't necessarily need to have that big of an impact. This really was kind of a solo lane kind of game for Evil Geniuses, and Revenge in particular looked fantastic. Gwen, we know, is a pick that can really dominate from ahead, and I think he did that. Overall, it's just good to see Evil Geniuses kind of get back on the right track after what was a miserable Week 5. Hopefully, this is the kind of confidence-building win that you needed in order to get back to where you were, you know, in the middle and beginning part of the split instead of last week, because, you know, that's really important, especially moving into playoff time. But at the end of the day, it is just Immortals. And speaking of Immortals, they're just not good. They're really, really, really not good. Like, I don't even have anything else to say at this point. Their players aren't very talented in comparison to the rest of the league. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Treats in the support position. This was a miserable game from Treats. I think he's been up and down. He's had good moments and he's had bad moments. I think him and Tactical have been kind of a bright spot for Immortals, but a lot of that I think has come down to Tactical. He was bad in this game. Treats was just not good. I mean, consistently messing up Alistair WQs and like just it's things that shouldn't happen, right? Like things that a pro support shouldn't do. It was just a bad game. And you're going to have those every once in a while. I'm not going to sit here and rag on him forever, but you can't say this wasn't a bad game. Mechanical execution was a major issue for him. And not only in this game, but it kind of has been throughout this entire split. So something to keep in mind. And then Kenvi continues to just not be very good for this team. He picked Nocturne into Poppy, which is just not the right decision. Like, there is no way to justify that matchup in the jungle. That's just a net negative for the Nocturne, and it absolutely played out as such. And so, I don't really know. Solo got run over in the top lane. Balulu and Tactical didn't really do anything. Balulu's been basically irrelevant the entire year. He's not necessarily been a positive, but the two picked Vigar in this game and lost lane and just didn't do anything. And it's like, okay, well, what are you going to do with this pick then? Why did you pick it if this was what you were going to do? So I don't know. I don't really know what to say for Immortals. It doesn't really feel like they have any identity. It doesn't really feel like they have any win condition. This to me is clearly the worst team in the LCS, and I think they showed it again here. And then for Evil Geniuses on the other side, like at the very least, this is a nice win. But again, like I said, it's Immortals. Like, it's great that you got your confidence back, and it's great that you showed you could still win here, and Shaden coming in and playing well is awesome. But you got to do it against better teams before I really start believing in you in the same way that I did before this series. And then moving on to our second game of day number 1, and it's a battle between two teams actually doing relatively well right now. We had Golden Guardians taking on Team Liquid, and Golden Guardians is going to be able to pick up the win here, and it's not surprising. This is one of the best teams in the league at the current moment, and honestly, they're kind of on pace to be the best team in the league at the moment. There is a very real chance that, you know, so long as, you know, Cloud9 isn't completely perfect, that Golden Guardians has at least an opportunity to be the number 1 seed in North America going into the playoffs. And with everything that has happened over the course of this year up until this point, this is no longer a surprise. This is no longer a shock to see them at the top or near the top of the standings. This is one of the best teams in North America, and they should be treated as such, at least at their current state. They're fantastic. Team Liquid is certainly not a pushover by any means. This team has gotten pretty consistent with APA in the mid lane. They still have their major issues, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but the big positive for Golden Guardians in this game has to be the jungle matchup. River was a no-brainer choice for player of the game. This is legitimately one of the best jungle performances that I've seen in quite a long time. He was so good in this role. Like, you know, Viego's one of those champions that I think obviously has a lot of really good traits. He's good at basically every part of the game, or at least he's competent at every part of the game. He's a good ganker. He is a really great team fighter, and being able to snowball the game out of control is really a big positive of his, but he gives the jungler a lot of agency to be able to win the game on his own. But, you know, even then, like, you still have to pilot him at a high level. Like, his numbers aren't crazy good at the current moment. He just offers you a whole ton. But River in particular, I mean, this was just one of those games that you go and study if you're a jungler to see how can you dominate your opponent. Pyosik is not a pushover, and I know he's not great at Vi, right? Like, that's always kind of been a thing with Pyosik. He's really never been super consistent on that champion, but River just perma-gapped, like, a world champion. That's really, really hard to do, but credit to River. This was not close, and it was a really, really good game from him. I've seen a lot of people starting to talk about him in, like, the MVP conversation. That's a little rich for my blood, right? Like, I don't know if I'm going to be putting him in that same kind of conversation with some of the other players that I think have really elevated their teams a little bit further than that, but he's easily a top 2 jungler in the league. Like, it's him and Blabber and then everyone else, in my opinion, and I don't even think that's all that controversial of a statement at this point. He still has been fantastic, and I think if you wanted to make an argument that he's been better than Blabber, I think it's on the table, right? Like, he can at least be considered for first team. I don't know if I'd go that far, but he's been very good, and I think there's a reason Golden Guardians has been so consistent, and it's how consistently River has won early. Now, the rest of the team was also good. Huhi, really good game on the Rel. I mean, he's just been so good all split. He's easily been the best support in North America in 2023. He continued that here in game number 2 on day number 1. Even going into someone like Core JJ, very difficult support to play into. Huhi was just the better support in this game, and that's no longer surprising. Again, he's very good. Gory's been fantastic over the last few weeks. He was phenomenal in week number 5, I should say, even though I didn't cover it. Stixxay was good. He got to play Ashe and be more of a secondary carry, which is good for this team. I think allowing other opportunities for other players on this team to step up, I think is a positive. Licorice got mega gapped in the top lane, got flame horizoned, but it doesn't matter because better top always loses. That's just kind of how it works. Obviously, that's a joke, but, you know, whatever. Like, your Jax gets super far behind, the Rumble gets super far ahead. Credit to Summit. We'll talk about him in a second, but Licorice getting flame horizoned and then being useful in team fights, like, that's fine. Like, you're gonna take that if River's gonna win as hard as he did in this game, although ideally you're not gonna have a situation like that. But, you know, good game for Golden Guardians, and they're really good. As for Team Liquid, okay, like, I don't know where to put this team, man. Like, are they really good or are they just kind of good? Because I don't know. They fall somewhere in the middle. Losing to Golden Guardians is certainly not a negative. Like, they are one of the top 2 teams in the LCS, and I think that that's pretty clear at the moment. And so, you know, dropping a game to them, I'm not going to freak out and overreact to that, but you kind of got blasted, like your jungle mid in particular, kind of got blasted, and they've been pretty good ever since APA subbed in. Dud of the game could go to either of them. I'm going to give it to Pyosik. In the jungle, it felt like he was more outplayed across this entire game. But APA also failed to capitalize on a lot of the plays that Pyosik was attempting to make. It just wasn't a very good game from either of them, and that's okay. You're allowed to have bad games every once in a while. Credit to Summit. Like I said earlier, Flame Horizon Licorice was up 100 plus CS throughout this game. It was a complete top lane domination, and yet the Rumble somehow really didn't have any sort of impact on any of the team fights. Kind of crazy how that ended up working out, but it's just kind of how League of Legends works at times. Yeon and Core were fine. Like, they certainly weren't the negative of TL. Really, the big gap was the jungle for TL, and the mid lane was also kind of there as well. APA did not have a very good game, but I expect this team to be able to bounce back. The question has never really been, are they going to be good? It's about whether or not they're going to be great, and I wanted to see them at the very least compete with a team like Golden Guardians to kind of prove to everyone that they can be in that top 3, that we should kind of take them seriously as a Worlds team or a potential Worlds team moving into the back half of this split. I'm really not sold that that is the case right now, and, you know, we'll see if they can change my mind on that moving forward, but really good win for Golden Guardians. This absolutely is a team that can compete for an LCS title, and especially right now with Cloud9 kind of being a little bit more vulnerable than maybe they've been in a little bit, this is a really nice win for Golden Guardians to prove that, you know what, watch out, maybe this is the year of the Guardian. And then moving on to our third game of day number 1, we had a matchup between FlyQuest and TSM. And FlyQuest picked up a crazy win here. You'll notice, you know, some of the rankings have changed a bit. TSM jumped all the way up to number 3 for me after week number 5. I felt so solid. I shouldn't say feel, because I'll talk about this game. I felt so solid about TSM. I was like, Insanity's back in. Everything's working. This team's unbeatable. They're like a team that could go to Worlds, might actually just go to Worlds, and everything's really, really working out. Yeah, they've got some weaknesses, but their consistency is so much higher than every other team in the LCS, yada, yada, yada. And then they go and lose to FlyQuest, and it's like, I was so close. And it's crazy because I didn't think I'd ever be wanting to see TSM succeed, but I love this group of players. And FlyQuest, you know, to their credit, I like this group of players as well. I know I've talked about this on the channel before, but there seems to be this prevailing narrative that, oh, FlyQuest spent a lot of money, they're a super team, you know, they brought in some Koreans, and so I'm really happy that they're losing, and I couldn't disagree with that more. I don't want organizations like TSM to succeed. I like the players on TSM, but I don't want an org like TSM to succeed over FlyQuest, right? I don't want the org that sits back and goes, I'm going to put the most budget roster together because I'm trying to leave the league, and it doesn't matter what kind of success we have. I don't want that to beat the team that's like, we're going to invest a lot of money, we're going to try and actually put out a good team that can compete on an international stage. That's the team and the org that I want to reward. I want to reward the orgs that are trying, and FlyQuest absolutely is trying. It's just unfortunate it hasn't worked out up until this point, but great game from them here. I mean, basically everything you could have asked for from FlyQuest finally came true in this one. Player of the game for me has got to go to Impact in the top lane. You know, you could say a lot of things about what's happened to FlyQuest over the course of this year, and Impact has certainly not been immune to some of the criticisms of what FlyQuest has undergone. He's had quite a few bad games over the course of this split, but when you talk about good games, it's like Impact, Spica's had one, I think Vicla's had one, and that's it, right? Like, those are your good games, right? It really has just been Impact holding down the fort for this team in a lot of different games, and going into a player like Hanser that has been, you know, at best a liability for TSM over the course of this split, it's just impressive to see what Impact has actually, you know, been able to do in this game. He got 4-man dove and he killed 2. He got a double kill. Like, absolutely absurd. Really good stuff coming out from him. His Rumble is insane. That champion is insane at the current moment, and Impact, I think, piloted him at a very high level. I'm just really happy to see him doing well because I think he's a very easy player to cheer for, and I think he deserves it. Vikla also had a really good game. I mean, we've been hyping up Insanity. There was a real argument to be made, and I would have said this if I made a video last week, that Insanity is actually in my MVP conversation, like top 3 at the current moment in terms of what he's actually been able to do for TSM. He's had a very similar impact, in my opinion, to this team, to what Jojo Pune's been able to do for Evil Geniuses. He's just had a couple less games to be able to do it, and that's high praise. I really like Jojo as well, but Vikla dominated him in this game. Playing the Jason to Nico matchup, like, obviously is going to be at least a little bit in favor of the Jace, but Vikla made it look like it was unstoppable, and his Jace has always been really good, so it's just about the consistency with him. We've had like 2 or 3 games this split where he's been really good, and every other one he's been really, really bad, and so I don't know what to get from him. Obviously, he had that one game where he was benched for Spyrax, and then he was right back into the lineup. I don't know what this team wants to do. He's good. He's a really good player. He's just got to be able to get his confidence back. Spica goes back onto the Amumu, picked this up a ton over the course of spring. For some reason, they wanted to drop it a little bit more. I think it's in a very similar place to what it was just a couple of months ago, but good game from him. Prince and Vulcan went deathless. That's always a positive. Vulcan in particular I thought was good. Prince has been largely irrelevant the entire split, and I think that continued in this game, but at the very least, he hasn't been like the biggest negative that this team has. Overall, it's a good win for FlyQuest. Technically, they're still alive, you know. Dignitas or 100 Thieves, like, they could shit the bed this week. They could go 0-3 and create a scenario where FlyQuest has a chance to play their way into the playoffs. You know, they'd have to go 3-0, and they'd really have to play well this week, but, you know, this is a good start. Being able to beat a team like TSM, who actually has been very good up until this point, it's definitely a good way to kick that off. And like I said, for TSM, like, I just wish that this didn't happen for them, because they really should be a good team, and this is not the performance of a good team. They got run over by a bad team in this one. Dud of the game for me could go to basically anybody. Almost gave it to Chime because he played Maokai support, and I'll be the first one to tell you that Maokai without items dies really, really fast. He does not do the whole tanking thing nearly as well as I think you would expect him to do it, considering, you know, what he does when he does have gold. Insanity was not very good. Boogie on the Nocturne was largely irrelevant the entire game. Hanser, even though he didn't die, got completely gapped in lane, but my dud of the game has got to go to Wild Turtle on the Tristana. You can't pick up Tristana, be this really aggressive ADC, playing with a really aggressive support in the Maokai, going into a scaling bot lane with the Kaisa, and just do absolutely nothing. Have 0 KP percentage. That's not good. You can't really get away with that. I don't think Turtle played all that well. His aggression was lackluster, and I think that the plays he tried to make weren't very good, and so he's going to get dud of the game. But again, I can't explain this enough. You can give dud of the game to all 5 members. None of them played well in this, and they all deserve at least some, you know, responsibility for how bad this team genuinely was in this game. This was Insanity's worst game in a long while. He got completely gapped by Vikla. Boogie was completely gapped by Spica, and honestly just gave Impact more gold in the top lane every time he went up there. Hanser got completely run over. Chime, like I said, died instantly in every single fight because he's playing a tank with no gold. Just not a very good performance from TSM. And honestly, I don't know if it was the draft. I don't know if it was just the mentality. This is not a performance I want to see again. If I start to see this again, I'm going to, say, never mind. Like, this team is not even close to top 4. They're not going to be able to compete in the playoffs because that's where they should have been all along. But really, up until this game, like, this was a team that I think a lot of people considered, like, oh, if they made Worlds, like, I wouldn't be that surprised. With how variable I would say the top 3 or 3 downwards in the LCS are at the moment. TSM very much felt like a team that could compete at that spot. Not at all in this game, and hopefully they can rectify that throughout the rest of this week. And then for FlyQuest, nice win, but you got to be able to do it 2 more times. If you don't win out, you're doomed. And even if you do, you're kind of in a bad spot. You got to rely on both 100 Thieves, or one of 100 Thieves or Dignitas to shit the bed. It's definitely possible, but they've dug themselves such a hole that it's going to be difficult to get out of. And then moving on to game number 4 here of day 1, and we get our first little upset, and it certainly makes things interesting in terms of the standings. We had Energy taking on Cloud9, and Energy is able to pick up a big win here. They fought back incredibly well from a rough early start to the split to be very competitive towards the back half of the split. I didn't cover week 5, but they were awesome in week number 5. Like I said before, Palafox in the mid lane was my player of the week in general for the entire LCS, and I think he's genuinely been phenomenal over the course of the second half of the split. But honestly, what's new? Like, this is what he has done for quite a while now. I'm not spoiling any of my all-pro picks because, quite frankly, even I don't know where I'm going to land on those until, I start to think about it before my primer. There's so many options. But remember, in summer of last split, I had Palafox as my 3rd team all-pro mid laner. In spring of this year, I had Palafox as my number 3 all-pro mid laner. I don't know where he's going to land, but every single split, it's like, he's okay, and then all of a sudden, oh, wait, he's actually really good. He's ramped up a ton over the course of the split, and he's going into playoffs incredibly hot. He's doing it again. It's become the trend with him, is that by the end of the split, he's going to be a top 3-ish mid laner in the NA LCS. Like, it just is what it is. He's a very good player, and I think a lot of orgs would be incredibly excited and happy to have him on the team. Had another good game here. I think Broadcast ended up giving him player of the game, but player of the game for me maybe surprisingly is going to go to Big Dokes on the top side. Dokla on the Cassante. Really good game from him here. I know the scoreline doesn't necessarily say it, but he was super influential towards all the fights towards the back half of the game. This was a rather close game from both sides. A couple of players playing really well. I thought Blabber had a great game. I think Berserker and Fudge played well. Sven had a couple of good engages, but Dokla was really, I think, the one to change a lot of those team fights. Cassante can have such a massive impact on the outcome of a game, and I think Dokla piloted it incredibly well. He's just such a reliable player, someone that is going to be a positive on the top side. Now, he'll have bad games. He's a little bit over-aggressive at times, but I think, especially 80 to 85% of his games are just really good. He's one of the better top laners in North America, and he has been for quite some time. Hasn't exactly been the best split of his entire career. I don't think it's been a bad one, but hasn't had those games like he's been having in previous splits where it's like, oh, this guy's, really, really good. Like, some of the Aurelia games he had in spring and then basically all of summer of last year, where it was like, oh, Dokla is, actually massive for this team. It hasn't quite been that. I think it's his weakest back in the LCS, but that's not to say it's been bad. He's certainly been a top laner in the league, and I think this was just another performance of hey, even though his laning hasn't exactly been perfect across this entire split, his team fighting is still sensational, and he can still be a massive positive impact towards the team that he plays for, in this case, Energy. One thing I also want to point out, bot lane has gotten super good for Energy, very quietly very good for Energy over the past couple of weeks. I know FBI and Ignar aren't exactly bringing in a lot of the headlines in terms of what they've been able to do, but they are so consistently winning lane, basically against everyone that they go into. And yes, I know it's Xayah Rakan into Kai'Sa, right? You should win that laning phase, but Berserker's really good. Berserker and Sven are both really good, and FBI and Ignar have been able to win super consistently over the course of the last few weeks. FBI's been awesome as a secondary carry for this team. I think he's really settled into that role well, and Ignar, I think, has really been good for this team over the last couple of weeks, and that's not something I expected to say. I thought Ignar was just going to be a weakness for this team moving into the rest of the split. Didn't have a lot of high hopes for him. He really hasn't been all that good at the LCS level in quite a while, but this has been a good turnaround. I would say he's still got some questionable, games in him for sure, but, in comparison to what he has been in, previous splits, I think this has been a pretty positive one overall for him on energy, and I think him and FBI have generally been pretty good for this team, and certainly aren't getting the kind of credit that they deserve because of how good the solo laners in particular are, and Contracts really was the carry for this team at the beginning part of the split, and so, a lot of good stuff from energy, and I really think everybody's kind of clicking right now. I like the draft, and I like the execution. It was good. And then for Cloud9 on the other side, frustrating loss here because this now puts you in a situation where you're not guaranteed the first seed going into the playoffs. And while it's not the worst thing in the world, honestly, having first seed is not all that important in comparison to like some of the other seeds. You certainly want to be top 2, but as long as you are top 2, it's not going to be that big of a deal. And I, would assume that Cloud9 would be able to finish out the split, but this definitely puts you in a more contentious race for that number 1 seed in the regular season. My dud of the game pretty obviously is going to go to Eminus in the mid lane. He really was the only player on the team that I found to be kind of lacking. I thought Cloud9 actually played relatively well in this game. A couple of plays, maybe a little bit of lack of aggression, and honestly just got out teamfight towards the back half of the game. But if there was a player that I think was giving more resources than necessary over to the enemy team, it was Eminus in the mid lane. I've been very, very complimentary of Eminus. I think if you had asked me at the middle point of the split, like week 3 in the LCS, I would have probably told you that Eminus was like my first or second team all-pro mid laner, right? Maybe right there with JoJo. JoJo probably would have been 1, Eminus would probably have been 2. But he has not been good over the second half of the split. He's certainly kind of been a lot more lackluster in laning phase and certainly a lot more up and down. And again, this is the same thing that happened in spring. He had that massive, kind of moment where he joined the team and really kind of reinvigorated them. And then you look at the last week of the season and it's like, oh, this guy's not very good right now, is he? And that's a concern. He got better in the playoffs, and so I have to imagine he's going to do that again. But it is worth noting that he's not having this dominant regular season like he was on pace to have at the middle point, the beginning and the middle point of the summer split. I think everybody else was relatively fine. Fudge had some good moments. Berserker was pretty good on the Kai'Sa. Sven was setting him up. Blabber had some good moments. Cloud9 was generally okay. They just lost the pivotal team fight, which is all that really needs to happen in order for you to lose a game that is this close. Credit to Energy, but, I expect Cloud9 to be able to bounce back. This really wasn't some sort of devastating loss that they didn't take seriously. They just kind of got a little unlucky towards the back half. But a nice win for Energy. They've been incredibly hot as of late. Hopefully they're able to keep it up because I think the playoffs are going to be a lot more interesting if Energy is good as well. I think it really does create a top 6 of teams, maybe even a top 7, depending on how you feel about Dignitas, of teams that are actually in, pretty good right now, and I think that just means better things for the league as a whole. And then moving on to our final game of day 1, and this one has some major implications when it comes to playoff time. We had a matchup between Dignitas and 100 Thieves, and Dignitas is able to pick up the 42-minute win. This game was a slog. It was very slow. It was very uneventful, but I think that very much plays into Dignitas' style. If you want to talk about words that are used to describe Dignitas and what they like to do, slow and uneventful are definitely ones that I think fit relatively accurately. It's one of the reasons why I am a little bit frustrated by the change that they made in their lineup. Now, obviously didn't get to go over it because, again, didn't cover week number 5, but Diamond is out. Poom is into the support position, and I don't hate Poom. I don't want it to come across like I hate him as a player, and I don't think he's an LCS caliber support. I think he probably is. I don't think he's a great one. I think he's a lower half LCS support. I don't think he's ever been the better version of that bot lane on CLG, but that's just my opinion. I still think he has upside. A lot of other teams seem to have thought that he's had a lot of upside as well. He's really been highly prioritized by a couple of different organizations now, but one of the things that Diamond did for this team that I think was incredibly underrated was he was the only one who tried to make plays. Like, he was the only one who was going out there and trying to be aggressive, right? Like, Rich does it sometimes, mostly towards the back half of games in the teamfight stage, and Tomo's not afraid to try and make plays, but Santorin and Jensen are probably the most passive jungle mid duo of any team in any major region. They just don't really get up and move around and create a lot of action. They play very slow. And introducing Poom, a player who, quite frankly, also plays slow, has made Dignitas play so much slower. And we saw it in week 5 when they went 0-3. This team could not catch up to good teams. I think they're worse. If I'm being entirely honest, I think bringing Poom in has made them worse. Not because I hate Poom, but just because I think as a fit, it's not working. Just like for Diamond, like, him being on this team didn't work. It looked worse for him because he was the only one trying to make plays. I just don't think that a collection of players that are as passive as Dignitas is going to work over the long haul. Rant aside, Rich is still really good at League of Legends. He's going to get my player of the game here. He's honestly, I don't want to say underrated at this point because the community is incredibly high on him, and I think they know how good he is, but I don't really see a lot of people talking about him as an all-pro guy, like a top 3 top laner. He probably should be in that conversation, and, I know that there are a lot of better brand names out there that are probably going to get votes over him, but I think Rich has been just as good basically the entire split. Like, I'm not saying he's immediately the best top laner mechanically, or like who I would take number 1 in terms of like if I'm building a team. I'm not even saying I would take him in the top 3, but he's played like a top 3 top laner throughout a lot of this split, and I think that definitely counts for something. But really good game from him on the Cassante. We've seen a couple of really good performances from that champion this week already. That will continue as we continue to move on, but rest of the team was still good. I thought Jensen had a pretty good game on Ziggs. Jensen's a good player. I think if he was surrounded by more aggressive players, he would continue to look like one of the best mid laners in the LCS. I think the problem is that, again, stylistically, I don't think Jensen fits this team very well, and I think that continues to come out. Tomo's a good player. I like him quite a bit. I don't think he's a superstar in the bot lane, but he's an LCS caliber bot laner, and Santorin I don't think made any major errors. He could have been more aggressive, and I certainly am going to continue to say that about him basically for the entirety of his time on this team, because I think that in general is just kind of a theme for him, but he was fine. He didn't make mistakes. Same thing with Poom. Again, was a little bit more aggressive than he was in week number 5 on this game in Nautilus, which I think is a positive overall, but I just am not super sold on Dignitas at the current moment. I'm not really sold on any of the teams in the bottom 4, if I'm being honest, and that definitely includes 100 Thieves at the moment, who are just not good. Like, there really is no other way to put it. This is not a good League of Legends team. They have so many major flaws as a team that I just don't really see them being able to figure it out before, it gets time to playoff time. And honestly, something disastrous would have to happen in order for 100 Thieves to miss playoffs, but it absolutely is on the table if they don't get their shit together soon. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Closer again. He's been really bad this split. There really is nothing else to say. He's been really, really not good this split, and I wish I had some sort of explanation, but it feels like he has changed playstyles so much. He was always known as the incredibly aggressive jungler that sometimes would get in trouble for being a little bit too active in the early game. Whatever happened in Spring Split, he got incredibly passive. He stopped trying to make plays. He stopped trying to move around the map. I don't know if he just doesn't trust himself or if it's like, somebody shot calling or whatever it is, right? But it's just not there for him, and it's not working. This style of play does not work for Closer as a player. It takes away pretty much all of the things that made him a really good jungler in the past, being able to create for the rest of his lane. And so it'll be interesting to see if he ends up adapting, but he's one of the worst players in the LCS in Summer Split, and I don't even think it's really all that debatable. Someday was also really bad in this game, got completely run over by Rich. I don't think Someday's really been all that bad this split, but I certainly don't think he's been good either, just kind of a net neutral for a team that has been reliant on their bot lane to win them basically any game that they've needed to across this split so far. I thought Quid had a couple of good moments on the Jace. Double Lift and Busio don't really make any major mistakes. Sometimes they're a little bit far forward, but most of the time that's because they're the only two that are trying to win the game for 100 Thieves. I just don't think this team is very good, and this loss kind of solidifies this. These are both teams that are trying to win games this week to secure themselves into playoffs. With this win, I think Dignitas does end up doing that, but 100 Thieves is technically still on the chopping block. If they go 0-3 this week, and if FlyQuest go 3-0, then there is still a world in which there's a tiebreaker that FlyQuest can use to get into the playoffs. 100 Thieves never want to hit that scenario, though, so I imagine they're going to crank it up for the rest of this week. But for Dignitas, it's a nice win. I just don't really believe in this team. I was kind of feeling them towards the middle part of the split. It felt like Rich was playing well, Jensen was stepping up, but it feels like this team has kind of regressed back to closer to what they were in spring, which is a team that is just so anti-proactive that it's almost frustrating to watch. Hopefully, I can be wrong about that. I really am hoping that that's just something that they can fix, but I really just don't have a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to get it. And then moving on to day number 2 now, and we get to kick day 2 off with a pretty interesting matchup between maybe the 2 worst teams in the league at the moment. We have FlyQuest taking on Immortals, and FlyQuest is able to pick up the win. We talked about them needing to go 3-0 this week, and their schedule definitely allowed that possibility, especially after they beat TSM. It's certainly not going to be easy, and, we'll talk about that. They've got basically the hardest challenge possible at the end of the week, but FlyQuest has gone 2-0 to start the week. All they need is either, well, I guess I shouldn't say either, because Dignitas won. They beat 100 Thieves, so they need 100 Thieves to go 0-3, and their playoff hopes are technically still alive, which is crazy to say. This does officially end Immortals' playoff chances, though. Not that that was really all that up in the air. We never really thought that they were going to be able to go 3-0 in any week, and that was definitely the case. They were not good this week, and they have now officially been locked in, at the very least, as last place in the LCS, and it's just another split of Immortals not being very good. Not entirely surprising. We'll get to them in a bit. But for FlyQuest, I mean, at least they're winning games against bad teams. Like, I know TSM isn't a bad team, but they certainly played bad on day number 1. And Immortals is a bad team, and they were able to take them down. So that's good, right? Like, they're not the worst team in the LCS. Even at their absolute worst, they're not the worst team in the LCS, which I think is a good sign. But a lot of that is hinging on the players that are just really, really good. The players that have been really consistent, most notably Impact in the top lane, who's going to get another player of the game for me. He's actually going to get dangerously close to being like an all-pro caliber top laner. I don't think I'm going to end up in a situation where I consider him, if only because like there were a lot of bad games from Impact over the course of this split that I think don't get called out nearly as much because Vikla played really bad or Vulcan played really bad. Mostly it was those two, but like Spica and Prince also had bad games, but Impact also had some negative games over the course of this split, and so probably not going to end on that, but Impact has been pretty good for this team, especially in comparison to what they've been able to output as a team. What, you know, the win column is not necessarily caught up, I think, to Impact's performance, and, you know, he's really trying his best. I don't think he's ever missed the playoffs, and if he has, it would have been on, like, tip, like back in the day, you know what I mean? Like it would have been on energy or something back in the day, and so he's clearly motivated to keep that streak alive, and you know, he's trying his best. It certainly is the case here, but he dominated solo in lane. Another really good Cassante game. I told you that was going to be a theme for a lot of week number 6. Not that it's surprising to see Cassante dominating the champion. It's just crazy broken, but, you know, I mean, it's still good to see nonetheless. The rest of the team was also good. This was one of Prince's best games in quite a while on the Kai'Sa. He really has been kind of irrelevant over the course of this split, not even in like a bad way, just in like a meh kind of way. He certainly wasn't dragging this team to any wins. He wasn't being good for this team, but he was far from the player that was inting the most. I think a lot of the rest of the team was struggling a ton, and Prince kind of took a back seat because of that, but he's been whatever, right? He's just kind of been an irrelevant bot laner, which is not what you're paying Prince to do. This was the person that I had as my MVP of the spring split in the regular season, and he's just kind of been nothing so far in the summer split, which has been really not good. Vulcan had a much better game on the Alistar than he has in a long time. I think Vulcan's actually kind of flown under the radar for how not good he's been. There have been a couple of games that have been really bad from him. There have been some good games as well. I don't want to pretend like he's only had bad games, but I think a lot of blame goes on Vikla, rightfully so. Vikla's been kind of bad in the mid lane. Not kind of bad. He's been pretty bad in the mid lane, but Vulcan, I think, has also been pretty bad in the support position. But Vikla has had a really good week up until this point. He was way better in the mid lane in this one than Balulu. He was way better earlier in the week than Insanity. So some positives coming in from him, and Spica got to play Ivern. He's been good at Ivern for quite a long time. I'm surprised to see this team not prioritize that pick even higher over the course of this split. So a win for FlyQuest that moves them to 6-11. That's probably more wins than people give them credit for in terms of, you know, what their split has actually been up until this point, but it won't matter if they're not able to take down the Giants in Cloud9 on the final day of the season, because without that win, all of the rest of them aren't going to matter. They're still going to be a bottom 2 team, and so important for FlyQuest, and a lot of other things have to go right as well. But for Immortals, their season is now officially over, and, you know, they're not good. Like, I hate to say it, this organization just has failed on multiple accounts to put a relevant team on the Rift, and that's just been something that's continuous. And it's weird for me because at times it really does feel like they have tried, like at the beginning of this year or last year. I think of like last summer where they went out and got Kenvi, and they went out and got, you know, Power of Evil, and they really did try to build a team that had talent. Lost was on that team. Ignar was on that team. Like, there were players that I think a lot of people would consider, you know, interesting players on that team, or at least would have considered them trying by going and getting. It just didn't work, and that's okay. Like, I'm not going to fault it for not always working. I'm not going to fault FlyQuest management for putting together this team and having it not work. But this season, I mean, this team was never going to be all that good. If your best player is tactical, like, that's a little bit of a problem. If Balulu's the one that's supposed to carry you across the finish line, you're going to be a bottom 2 team in the LCS, and that really just is what it is. Tactical actually played really well this split, and I think he's the highlight of Immortals. It's kind of crazy. It really did feel like Team Liquid Tactical again, rather than TSM Tactical. I'm not exactly sure that's going to be sustainable, but it's cool to see him get some of his confidence back. But everybody else in this team was miserable. Balulu's going to get done of the game here. This is one of the worst Twisted Fate performances that I've seen in an incredibly long time. Solo had some good moments this split, but this was an awful game on a super broken pick right now in Rumble. Kenvi got his signature Graves, his best champion, the one that he's most been able to affect the map, and he still looked like he had no pressure. And Treats has honestly just not been good for this team, mechanically speaking. Maybe he adds more when it comes to the shot calling and the management, but like just from a mechanic perspective, it's not working. Immortal season is over, and obviously they have one more game on the final day, but this team was not very good, and I think it's apropos that they go out in last place. And for FlyQuest, again, like I said, their season is technically still alive, but a lot would have to go right for them not to be joining Immortals by the end of this week. 100 Thieves would have to go 0-3. FlyQuest would have to be able to take down Cloud9 on the final day, and all of that would have to conclude with FlyQuest being able to beat 100 Thieves in a tiebreaker game to get into the playoffs. So technically possible, but again, like I said earlier this week, the hole that they dug themselves might just be a tad bit too deep for them to drag their way out of, if you will. And then moving on to our second game of day number 2, and it was a matchup between TSM and Cloud9, two teams that actually have looked good going into this week, but haven't necessarily looked as good so far in the final week of the season, and we see Cloud9 being the one to get back on track in this one. TSM continues to kind of slide down, and this was a dominating game. This was 20 minutes of just Cloud9 being the better team, and this is kind of what they've done across this entire split, is they'll drop a game to some random team, and then in the next game, they will absolutely obliterate whoever is unfortunate enough to have to go into them, and in this case, it was TSM, who really is struggling so far in week number 6. We'll get to them in a second. I don't think it was nearly as bad as some people are going to give it credit for, although I do think that there were a lot of negative takeaways from this game for them as well. But for Cloud9, player of the game, pretty obviously for me, is going to go to Sven in the support position. He's been pretty good this split. I actually have really liked what Sven has been able to do. I've never really considered him like a top 2, top 3 support in NA. I don't really know why. I just don't think that he necessarily impacts the game as much as what I consider to be the big 3 going into this year, of course, being Vulcan, Core JJ, and Huki. I thought those 3 were just so consistently great that it was hard for me to imagine a world where Sven was going to kind of break into that, but I think this has probably been his best, most consistent split as a support. I think he's been very good across this entire split, certainly an all-pro caliber support playing off of Berserker in the bot lane. Just good stuff overall from him, and I thought his rel in this game in particular was actually pretty fantastic. Really, really good to see him be able to start pick up some of those engagers. I know that was a complaint from, a lot of the community. I had been guilty of saying that on this channel as well, but I never really thought it was that bad. It really felt like it was Alistair and then all the other engagers, but rel seems to be something that this team does like to go to, and, I have a sneaking suspicion that Blabber would also be able to pick up that champion. It feels like it would fall right into his wheelhouse in terms of the things that he likes to play, but Sven does pilot it well. It's probably his most consistent engager this year up until this point, and he was really good this game, but already mentioned him. The other player you gotta shout out is Blabber in the jungle, who I think somehow is being underrated in terms of what he's been able to output this split. I think he's been the best player on Cloud9, and I don't even think it's that crazy to make that kind of statement. He's been so good, and I don't think you're going to hear that all that frequently coming from a lot of people. I see a lot of, people on Reddit saying that River's been the best jungler in the LCS. For me, it's pretty clearly been Blabber, although I can understand the argument the other way, because I think both have been really good, but Blabber is just crazy consistent. He's going to be able to give you exactly what you need most games of the year, and that's just something that junglers in the LCS don't do at a consistent level. So Blabber and Sven definitely were the standout members. Eminus, I thought, had a much better game on the Tristana, something he can actually flex some of his mechanical superiority on. Berserker on the Aphelios is a combination that has certainly worked for this team over the past couple of months, and then Fudge on the Cassante looked good in that same vein. But like I said, Blabber and Sven definitely the standout members. And then for TSM on the other side, I don't want to panic because losing to Cloud9 is certainly fine, but losing to FlyQuest was not, and going 0-2 to start week number 6 after looking so good in weeks 4 and 5 is not what I wanted to see right before playoff time. They have locked a playoff spot. Like, it's not a concern whether or not they're going to be able to be in the playoffs. 8 wins is enough to get you into the playoffs, but this team should not be looking at 8 wins. They were absolutely, surging towards the end of the last couple of weeks, so much so that I think a lot of people are considering them a dark horse to make Worlds, right? Me included. I had them at number 3 in my power rankings, and they've just not lived up to that expectation. Done of the game for me is going to go to Boogie in the jungle. I don't think think he's necessarily been a problem for this team in their losses, but I think he's been a little bit overstated in terms of what he does in their wins, and, you know, he was kind of bad in this game on the Maokai. Blabber was everywhere on the map affecting things as the Ivern, and when you've got a low damage comp like what TSM put together here, which, by the way, wouldn't be low damage if you didn't have Ashe. I think Ashe is the only thing that makes this comp quote-unquote low damage. Like, Maokai Jace as a mid-jungle duo, I think, is incredibly strong right now, and something that we're seeing in basically every region, but I just don't think you can play something like the Ashe in the current meta with it. I digress. I just see that comment thrown around a lot. You know, you're relying a lot on the Maokai to be able to establish tempo, and it felt like Blabber always had the tempo in this game, and that's on Boogie. You got to be able to establish that early, and I feel like he didn't. It felt like he didn't. Wild Turtle didn't play very well on the Ashe either. He's having a pretty poor final week of the season, which is definitely unfortunate. This might just be his worst week of the season up until this point, and that's not really what you want to see at this time. Chime is fine. He was okay on the Alistar. I don't think he was the problem here. Insanity tries to deal damage on the Jace, but there's only so much you can do, and Haunter is just not a positive at this level. His laning is just so atrociously bad that there's really no way to mask it at this point. But for TSM, again, I don't want to completely throw out the analysis that I had on them, but I probably was a little bit too rich putting them up at number 3. Instead of, you know, keeping them at around number 5 or number 4 where I had them before. I think that last week might have been a little bit more of a fluke than I was giving them credit for, and that's being shown here. And then for Cloud9 on the other side, this is a very, very good League of Legends team, especially after they lose a game. They just feel so motivated to come out and prove everybody wrong, and I think that's what they did here. Zven is playing really well, Blabber is playing really well. I think those are the two standouts. Of course, Berserker is fantastic, arguably the best player in the LCS, and even if Eminence and Fudge aren't playing at their peak level at the current moment, I still think that they have more than enough firepower to be able to secure that spot. This is a nice win, though, because remember, they are still fighting for that number 1 seed. And then moving on to our third game of day number 2 here, and this one's definitely going to have some playoff implications, and we'll get into why, because we had 100 Thieves taking on NRG. And 100 Thieves is going to be able to pick up a massive win here. NRG goes from, you know, actively being one of the best teams in the league and, you know, beating Cloud9 and being really dangerous and having a lot of these players play at a high level to losing to the middling 100 Thieves is the best way I could possibly put what this team has been going through in the recent weeks. And again, not rational gaming has certainly carried over. They truly are still counter logic. They have definitely maintained that reputation in terms of how they've been able to perform. But with this 100 Thieves win, more importantly, FlyQuest has now been officially eliminated from playoff contention, with 100 Thieves winning, getting to 7 wins. That means that FlyQuest can no longer get into the playoffs. The best they can do is 6 if they beat Cloud9 tomorrow, and 100 Thieves would be that final team at 7, with Dignitas beating them earlier in the week. So we have our 8 playoff teams decided with this 100 Thieves win. Not that really it's all that surprising to see the 2 teams that are at the bottom go out, but to see FlyQuest not even be able to make top 8 is absolutely absurd. If you would have told me that before the split started, I would have called you absolutely insane. That is genuinely one of the things I would have been most surprised about. There are often times where there's teams, you know, a team like Golden Guardians, if you told me before spring that Golden Guardians was going to be in finals, like, I would have been like, that's a crazy take, but also, like, I guess it's possible if everything goes right. I wouldn't have even told you that it was possible for FlyQuest to be bottom 2. I just didn't even think it was in the space of possibilities after they brought Vulcan in, but it's the reality we're in. Enough talking about FlyQuest, though. Let's talk about this game number 3. Player of the game for me is going to go to Closer in the jungle. I've been ranting about him for weeks and about how, not proactive he's been. The lack of proactivity has been a huge problem for 100 Thieves, and I think it's really affected a lot of what the rest of this team has been able to do, but he was really good in this game. He was active, he was moving around the map, and maybe this is just what happens when he gets Viego. We've seen that champion banned out super consistently against 100 Thieves. Maybe that's just the only champion that Closer feels comfortable on in this current meta. It feels like a weird champion to be comfortable on, but at the end of the day, you know, whatever works, works, and so, you know, for Closer, this was the best game that he's had all split by a country mile. He was probably the front runner for worst player in the LCS, at least in the summer split, in terms of what he had been doing up until this game, but I think this game did at least show some positive traits, which I don't think a lot of other players who are kind of in that conversation for, you know, least good. I don't want to say worst because that's such a negative connotation, but, you know, slowest, coldest, I should say, summer split. You know, the other candidates I don't think had performances like what Closer was able to do today, so that's really, really good. I don't know if I'm expecting him to be able to turn it around. He was a lot better towards the back half of the spring split as well. He got a lot better in the last couple weeks of the season and then was okay in their playoff run, as bad as that playoff run was, but At the end of the day, he's just going to need to be good enough because you have other talent on this team that can win you games, most notably the bot lane. I hate to say it, I still think Doublelift has been really, really good for this team, an all-pro caliber bot laner, like legitimately. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, but he's been fantastic so consistently. He wins lanes so often, and he's useful in the mid game so consistently. This team really does like to play for him, and when they are able to do that successfully, it works. And he wasn't the focal point of this game. Closer was, but I still think he was really good. Busio was really good this game on his signature Rakan pick. It's easily his best champion. We've talked about that a lot on this channel over the course of this time, is that when he gets Rakan, he is a completely different player. I personally think it's a must ban against 100 Thieves. Xayah Rakan in particular is just not something you can give over, but Doublelift has shown that he can play a wide variety of AD carries, but if you give Busio Rakan, they're probably going to win pretty hard in the bot lane. Like I said earlier, some days been fine. Quid's been okay. I certainly don't think he's been good, but I don't think he's been horrendous. There have been worse players in the league, and so 100 Thieves, you know, I'm still not sold on them as a team because I do think their jungle mid weakness is exploitable when we get to the playoffs, but you know, they have talent. We know they have talent. We know they can win games, and so it's all just about putting it together. And then for Energy on the other side, man, what is this team? What is beating Cloud9 and then losing to 100 Thieves? Like, what is this trajectory that they are on? It's just what they do. They're not rational gaming. That's kind of the moniker that they have picked up on the internet, and I think it's a very funny one. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Palafox in the mid lane. It's just kind of the dichotomy of what Palafox offers. He's going to have fantastic games, but he's also going to have some pretty bad ones. He's a very volatile player, and, you know, as much as I do love Palafox, and as much as I do think that his highs this split have been just as good as any other split he's ever had in the history of his career, if not better, I think he's also had a lot more lows than he's had in the last couple of splits, and I know people kind of forget about those because a lot of them happened in week 1 or week 2. He was my dud of the week in the first week of the season. People forget that, and he was really bad in this game, and it's just going to happen. Palafox is a volatile player, and sometimes with volatile players, you're going to get worse performances, but, you know, usually the positives make up for it. I think it's just worth noting that he's not as unanimously great as I think a lot of people are trying to make him out to be. FBI also took a pretty big step back in this game. Contracts got out jungle. Dokla had no impact on the Ornn. Ignar had no impact on the Alistar. It just wasn't a very good game, I would say, overall for Energy. I think that they were really, you know, kind of on a hot streak going into this, and I think they blew a lot of that momentum here. Hopefully it doesn't matter. Hopefully they're able to finish out the regular season with another win and get themselves into that 10-win club, because I think that would be a really big positive for this team to finish above 500, but you're not going to be able to get there in this game. And 100 Thieves, really nice win. Securing yourself in that top 8 is absolutely massive, making sure that you're in a position to actually be able to, you know, be in the playoffs and try to qualify for Worlds. That's why Doublelift came out of retirement, not to just be an LCS bot laner, but to be a Worlds bot laner. And so this team, I think, still has a ridiculously long way to go to even before they start thinking about being on that level. But I guess if you were going to start somewhere, it's going to be a win over a team like Energy. And then moving on to our 4th game of the second day, and it's another battle between two teams that are, at least in the conversation for Worlds. We had Evil Geniuses taking on Team Liquid, and Evil Geniuses is going to be able to pick up that win. Really nice stuff coming in from them. Team Liquid 0-2 to start the week, but EG 2-0 to start the week. TL, I'll explain why I'm not as concerned. Two very difficult opponents to go into to start this week in Golden Guardians and Evil Geniuses that are very difficult to take down, but credit to EG. It feels like this team is at the very least a little bit back on track, and really, with how they're playing right now, it really does beg the question whether or not this lineup change is going to be permanent for them for the rest of the year, because that absolutely is a question here, whether or not Shaden is going to stay in the jungle. I've seen some people say absolutely, especially with how he's played, he's going to be staying in, but this guy's played, you know, 2 games so far. We'll get to the 3rd at the LCS level, and that's not a big sample size for a team that's trying to make the World Championships, and I know other teams in the past have done it, and it's worked out for them. Going to be interesting to see if EG goes in that direction, but it's really not Shaden that's driving this team forward right now. It's a lot of the other talent. Player of the game for me, pretty obviously, going to go to Ayla here on the rel. A ridiculous game coming out from Ayla. Really happy to see him have such a good split. He's not like an all-pro caliber support, in my opinion. A few too many costly games, but a couple of really good ones, and definitely is starting to show a lot of the promise. Specifically, love seeing him do this into core JJ, kind of the mentor figure for Ayla for so long in that Team Liquid organization where he was, and so really, really cool matchup there. Really cool to see Ayla step up, and Rel is just so crazy as a champion. I've talked about this champion for quite a while. I remember making a comment about this last year, and I didn't get any pushback. I kind of expected it because nobody was really having this conversation, I would say, in like 2021, 2022, when this champion was a little bit less frequent, but the more we see see of Rel, the more I'm just reminded, like, God, for a pro player, like, I'm not trying to, say anything about solo queue, but for a pro player, Rel makes engage so easy. Like, Rel just makes creating plays and being the teamfight hero so much simpler for the support. And that's not to take anything away from Ayla, because Ayla's a really good player. And I do think you still have to be good to pilot Rel well. We've seen bad Rel players, especially in the jungle matchup, where you just got to be significantly more clinical, but man, like, Rel is one of those champions that is, if you're in, you're in. Like, you don't really got to do all that much after that point. You either hit your engage or you don't, and it's not particularly difficult to hit. You've got a crazy range on that engage, and so I would say good stuff from Ayla. Rel is a crazy good champion, and Ayla definitely showed it off here. Good stuff cleaning up from the solo laners. Revenge is having a hell of a week. He dominated Summit in this game. Like, he was just way, way better in this matchup. That's the second time this split that Revenge has dominated Summit. It just feels like that's a matchup, I guess, that Revenge feels very comfortable in, but, we'll get to that in a minute. JoJo was really good in this game on his signature Sylas. I would consider that his signature pick, at least in pro at this point. It really does feel like the one I most associate with him. Sylas is just so up his alley in terms of how he likes to play the game. Can be aggressive in laning phase, but most of the time it's just going to be looking for skirmishes in the mid to late game. Can be very aggro in team fights and just kind of take over games, and I really like it for JoJo. Unforgiven went deathless in this one on the Kai'Sa in a very bloody game, which is impressive. And like I said, Shaden was good as well, even if he was probably the most forgettable player on the team in this one. Still, Evil Genius is looking really, really good. If this is the real form and not what we saw last week from them, this is still a top 3 team like I had them a week or so ago. And so, really nice win from them here. And then for Liquid on the other side, rough loss, man. Frustrating loss, honestly, because you really should be more competitive than this. I think there were a couple of plays that looked okay. I really like how APA played this game on the Tristana. It felt like he was trying to stay active and move around the map. I don't think Yon has had a bad game since he entered the LCS. I don't think he's had a bunch of great, like, not every game has been a great game is what I'm trying to say, but, like, there's been no awful games. Like, he doesn't int. He basically never ints, and I think that is a really good quality in a position where you need stability, but top side of the map was a major issue for Team Liquid in this one. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Summit in that top lane matchup. A really bad game from him on the Renekton. You rarely see him lose lane as hard as he did in this one, but again, he's done that multiple times to Revenge in particular. It just seems to be a matchup that is very Revenge favored, I should say. Flavored? What am I talking about? Revenge favored as a player, and you got to give him a lot of credit for that, but Summit, kind of a worrying trend here. I'm not going to say that it's exactly this, but he in the past has shown multiple occasions of fantastic start to the split, looking really good, and then as we go along, he just gets worse and worse and worse. He's been just as good in lane. Like, I don't want to take away the fact that I still think he's a very good laner, and that I still think he creates a lot of positives for this team, but man, he just makes some critical mistakes towards the back half of a lot of games, and so when he loses lane like he did in this one, it's even more noticeable because he doesn't really have that fallback in terms of team fighting. And then Pioshik was also really bad in this one on the Maokai. He's having a rough week in that same vein. That's okay. Pioshik's a very streaky player. We know that. We've known that his entire career, even when he's been on really good teams. Obviously won the World Championship last year, but, a lot of people were saying he wasn't a starting caliber jungler going into that World Championship, and so it's just the dichotomy you get with Pioshik. If he's on, you're going to win. If he's off, it's going to be a lot more difficult, and it's just kind of what it is, but this team still has talent. Again, I don't want to overreact to things like this. They're still only one game away from being a double-digit win team, and they still absolutely have an opportunity to, at the very least, go to that qualifier to compete for a world spot, but, I need to see some consistency with this team. Losing to both Golden Guardians and Evil Geniuses is fine in isolation, because losing to the best teams is fine in isolation if you don't want to be one of them, but Team Liquid wants to be one of the best teams, and I think this performance just shows that they're probably not on that level. And then for Evil Geniuses, nice win. It really does feel like this confidence is back. The win over Immortals was questionable because it's Immortals, but beating Team Liquid is a very nice win. Hopefully, they're going to be able to keep this kind of momentum up moving into the future weeks. And then moving on to our fifth and final game of the middle day here in the final week of the LCS, we had a matchup between yellow teams in the Golden Guardians and Dignitas that Golden Guardians was able to take a win in. Again, not a particularly surprising outcome here. They absolutely should be the better team, but remember, with that Cloud9 loss on day number 1 to Energy, they're actually in a relatively interesting spot to potentially fight for that number 1 seed. So long as they win out, if Cloud9 wins out as well, they're going to be a tiebreaker, and that's a really big situation for an organization like Golden Guardians that has never been in that situation before in the regular season. You know, obviously they made finals in spring, but remember, they were 9-9 in spring. This is the first time they've ever finished above 500, let alone been in contention to be the #1 seed in the entire region. And so, really good stuff coming in from this team. It's easily the best in the organization's history, and honestly, one of the more fun ones that we've had in recent LCS history, in my opinion. And a lot of that is just the dynamic personalities and, you know, the players that we've grown to love, and especially the bot lane here, Stixxay and Huhi, who are playing, in my opinion, at the best level that they have ever played at. It's a difficult conversation for Huhi because I thought he was really good on Golden Guardians the first time when he was playing with FBI, and that team was really surprising, and then he went over to 100 Thieves and was really good there as well. But you could absolutely make the case that this is the best version of Huhi of all time, you know, including the mid lane run. Like, I think everything included, this is probably the most consistent and most dominant version of him that we've ever gotten, and that really is saying something. And I think at this point we can clearly say that this is the best version of Stixxay. I know there's going to be some 2016 truthers out there that are like, man, you know, old Stixxay on CLG was, you know, a top 5 ADC in the world. And, you know, I think that, well, I don't agree with that statement. I think that there is reason to believe that he was a very good player, but the confidence that he's playing with right now, it just feels like he's an upgraded version of what he was in 2016. That aggressive player that sometimes could get himself into trouble is now just as aggressive, but now has the knowledge and the patience to be able to back that up, and is just a ridiculously positive player overall. Both of them are playing at an incredible level right now. Player of the game is going to go to Huhi, but you could realistically give this to Stixxay as well. I think it really should go to Huhi. He was the one creating so much for this team, but it's not like Stixxay played poorly. He capitalized on everything Huhi did at a ridiculously high level. It's just that these two are playing so well, and they're so fun to watch. They are a dynamic duo. They're really fun personalities. They're legends in this, you know, in this league and in this region, and, you know, they're performing like it at the moment. It's very, very easy to like this team because of these two, and it's not just these two, it's everybody else on the team as well. Gory is playing at a really high level. He might be the most consistent mid laner in the entire region. Obviously, JoJo's doing really well right now, but Gory's also been fantastic this split. River has been really, really good in the jungle. Talked about him being a top 2 jungler pretty clearly. Licorice might be the single best top laner in the LCS right now. Golden Guardians is just clicking basically on all levels, and you've got to be so excited for this team. Hopefully they can hang on because, you know, it's been a really fun ride, and in this game I think they did everything right. A lot of moving around the map, a lot of playing really aggressive, taking advantage of Dignitas' biggest weakness, which is the fact that they are whatever the opposite of proactive is, you know, completely stagnant in a lot of their game plans. They certainly took advantage of that in the early to mid game, and they created a ton of pressure, and they capitalized on it really well. Look at the Talia pick. Look at the Rakan pick. You're going to be moving around the map. Kindred wants to skirmish, and so Dignitas really couldn't keep up, and I think they did a really good job of capitalizing on that. But for Dig, like, this is the problem. This is the reason they will never be a competitive team in the LCS, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. If I really don't think that this team is all that bad, I think mechanically speaking, there are some really talented players on this team, but when Golden Guardians picks Talia, and when they pick Rakan, and when they pick Kindred, and they're like, we're going to force you to skirmish in the early game, Dignitas is not going to be able to answer that. They're just not the type of team that is going to be able to do that. They are simply too slow for this league, and that's crazy to say because the LCS for many years has been the slowest professional league, at least of the major regions, and I just don't think that's the case anymore. My dud of the game is going to go to Poom on this rel. I was talking about how strong this pick was a game ago on Ayla, and Poom made it look completely bad in this game, and that's the point, right? Is like the difference is you need to be a very good support in order to pull off the combos because you have to set them up well. Once you get there, it's relatively easy, but, you know, you got to be able to put yourself in a position where you can actually, you know, engage and not just instantly die as Rel, and Poom was just not in that situation. I don't mean to be that guy. I don't mean to hate on Poom. I've always been lower on him as a player, and I know that's a little bit of a channel history thing, but Poom is not as good as Diamond, and I think that that has become abundantly clear through 5 games of Poom. I think it was a mistake to bench Diamond and bring Poom in, especially with no practice. You know, say what you want about how bad Diamond was. I think Poom has absolutely been worse through the first 5 games. He has yet to have a good game. Even their one win earlier this week against 100 Thieves, it really didn't feel like him. It felt like Rich playing really well, right? And so I don't know. Maybe I'm just a hater. You can call me that. Say what you will. I'm not seeing it, and I want to see it. I like Poom. I like endemic North American talent, but I really am not seeing it. I thought Tomo actually played relatively okay on the Varus, tried to do some damage, but the rest of this team was not there. Jensen had a poor game. Rich had a very poor game on the Cassante, and Santorin, as per usual, was just not willing to try and contest everything that River was doing in the early to mid game. And so for Dignitas, they're just not a very good team. Like, them and 100 Thieves, I think, yes, they're both locked into playoffs. I would be shocked if they were able to win playoff series playing the way that they are right now. Maybe something figures out for either of these teams. 100 Thieves, I see it as a little bit more likely because of the talent, but for Dignitas, this identity that they've cultivated for themselves, I think, is such a hindrance towards actually being a competitive team in this league, and I think it's going to, cause them to not really be competitive in the long run. And then Golden Guardians, speaking of competitive, they're very good. They're going to compete for an LCS title, and they're showing that off right now. They might have the best bot lane in the LCS. I mean, it really is a competition at this point with Berserker and Sven, who I would have said blew everybody else out of the water, halfway through this split. Stixay and Who here absolutely in that conversation. And Gory's a top player in his role. River's a top player in his role. Licorice is a top player in this role. Golden Guardians are just like elite around the horn right now in every single role. And man, you just got to be super excited for this team and for this org. And then moving on to our third and final day of action here. Remember, there is an absolute real chance that we have some tiebreaker games to get into after the end of these 5 games in the final day. So we might not be wrapping up in the final 5, but it is the start of the final day of the regular season in 2023 here for the LCS. And we got to kick off that final day with a matchup between Immortals and NRG. That, of course, Immortals is able to pick up the win in. This is just the LCS special. Honestly, every region does this. As soon as a team has been officially eliminated from competition, when they can no longer go anywhere, when their wins don't matter anymore, all of a sudden they become Prime SK Telecom T1. That's just how League of Legends works. It is so consistent, and especially against a team like NRG, who has been so inconsistent against the worst teams in the league. For them to lose to Immortals in the final game of the regular season, who didn't see this coming, if we're being entirely honest? Just a very obvious situation for both of them to fall into. So good stuff overall from Immortals. Really happy to see them pick up their 5th win of the season, and obviously it doesn't really do anything for them. It doesn't matter, but these players are trying hard, and it's good to see them not quit and not give up and be able to pick up a win in their final game of what was a pretty disastrous year just in general for the organization. My player of the game is going to go to the player who really was the best on Immortals across all of 2023. It's going to go to Tactical in the bot lane. I know a lot of people were ready to completely write Tactical off, and honestly, I was pretty damn close to being a part of that. He was so good for Team Liquid for so many years, but maybe we all were just like, that was a really good team, a really good org. He got to play with Core JJ, and we know what Core does to AD carries. He makes all of them look really good, and so, Tactical going to TSM and being as disastrous as he was very concerning, and he wasn't particularly great in Spring either, although he definitely had his moments of being pretty positive, was certainly not consistent, but honestly, I think his summer split has actually been really good. If you take his performances in isolation, take out the fact that this team absolutely sucks around him, I actually think Tactical's played relatively well all split long, and he's definitely been the MVP for Immortals in 2023, and that's a very exciting thing to say. Hopefully that means that he's going to have some longevity in terms of being able to continue to play in the league. His peak was so crazy good that it would be an absolute shame if he was out of the league, less than 3 years after all of that happened, but this is enough for me to be like, yeah, I'd absolutely give him another chance. Maybe it's here on Immortals, or maybe it's on a different organization. Maybe he doesn't get that other chance, because obviously he didn't get really the opportunity to win all that much this year, but I think he showed enough as an individual performer to actually be able to play. Obviously got to pull out his signature pick here in the Callista. That was something that was such a massive pick for him during his main peak in 2020 and 2021 on those Team Liquid teams, to be able to pull it out here again in the final game of the season when not much matters anymore, and for him to do so well on it. It's pretty narratively satisfying, I think is a good way to put it. It's a very satisfying way to cap off this split. I think Balulu had a pretty good game on the Azir. Really happy to see him finally have a good game this split. It felt like he was just kind of average for a lot of the games this split, but this one he was actually good. And Kenvi pulls out the Rel and actually has one of his better games of the entire split. Did not see that coming. Solo was good on the very overpowered Rumble. He won laning phase against Dokla, which is not expected. And Treats was good on Renata in that same vein. And so overall, just a good game for Immortals. This is one of their more complete performances since week number 1, where they ended up 2-1, and that's not really what I expected. I mean, it's expected that Energy was going to be losing this one, but a good performance from Immortals, and obviously your season is over here, but there still is a lot to take away, and it's going to be interesting to see which direction this organization ends up going in at the beginning of next year. And then for Energy on the other side, I mean, what did we expect? Of course they end at 9-9 at 500 by losing to Immortals. That's just That's what not rational gaming was always going to do in a situation like this. Done of the game could really go to two members. I think you could give it to Dokla on the top side, who just did not have a very good game on the Yone, went for a really aggressive lane matchup, and the Rumble was just too strong. There really wasn't a lot that Yone could do in that matchup. He was taking way too much damage, even just trying to trade in lane. Very, very difficult for him to play out, but I'm going to give it to FBI in the bot lane, not because FBI played particularly miserable, but because I'm going to use this as an excuse to hate on the Ashe pick. I do not like Ashe. I don't think it's particularly good right now, and you want to know why? Because I do actually think that you need damage out of your bot lane. I think Ashe, as a facilitator, is actually in a really good spot right now to be that more utility-oriented marksman. You know, the role that she's always filled at the pro level, at a high level. If you want to play a more damage-oriented mid, a more damage-oriented top, or a more damage-oriented jungle, then I think you can pull out a more utility-focused bot lane and not really play to that side of the map. The problem with that is that, you know, damage in the mid lane really isn't all that big of a deal right now unless you're able to get pretty specifically, like Tristana. Like, I guess you could get a Azir, but you're going to need that marksman damage, and if you don't have that Tristana, if you have something like an Ahri, like Energy did in this game, who was strong, Palafox had a very good game on the Ahri, none of it mattered because Ahri can't solo carry damage. Like, you needed the Yone to be online, but even then, he's not going to be able to do it. This was always just going to be a quote-unquote low damage comp because, in general, Ashe is just low damage, and so if you're not supplementing that with multiple other high damage threats, then you're just not going to be able to make use of that Ashe pick in a way that I think is going to be as useful as just picking a standard marksman that's going to be there to deal damage. And so FBI was dealing no damage this game. You could tell in pretty much every exchange he really was not hurting all that much. He didn't make any sort of individual major mistakes. He was a little bit far forward in some of those engages, but the team was behind. He was trying to catch up. I understand. It really was the fact that he was entirely useless because the champion that he picked just didn't have a niche or a role in this game, and I think that that's kind of the avenue that I find Ashe falling in mostly in the current meta. But, you know, Ignar and Rakan wasn't all that great, a couple of bad engages, but mostly was just there for peel. Like I said, Dokla kind of got run over in the top lane matchup. He's the other one that you could definitely consider for dead of the game, but Palafox actually played really well here. Again, the dichotomy of Palafox, he's going to have some really good games, he's going to have some really bad games. It's just him as a player. And then Contracts was fine on Sejuani. It's one of the picks that he's been the most successful on, probably the pick that he's been the most successful on over the course of this year. It just wasn't able to work out in this final game, but they're in playoffs. They're at 9-9, a 500 record at most points in this split. For Energy, would have been a positive outcome for them. They did not start hot, but they really did end rather well, and it's going to be interesting to see if they continue that going into the playoffs. They've been able to dominate some of the top teams in the league, specifically the ones that are better than them, and so interesting to see if that will carry over into some of their series. But for Immortals, like I said, really good game, really good way to cap off your season, even if it doesn't necessarily mean anything in the grand scheme of things. And then moving on to our second game of the final day here, and it was a matchup between Evil Geniuses and TSM. And Evil Geniuses is going to pick up their third win of the week. They're going to lock themselves in at 12-6 on the split. That's a pretty damn good record. And TSM, who at one point looked like they were really surging towards the back half of the split, a potential 10, a potential 11 win team walking out of the summer regular season. Nope, we're going to stop at 8. It's all we wanted. We wanted to go 8-10. We don't want to be above 500. Why would we want to be above 500? We're going to collapse in the final week of the season. And you know what? They stayed true. They did that absolutely. Very, very TSM of them to do that. But congratulations to Evil Geniuses. This is a nice win, and a lot of the confidence, it feels like, is back for this team. There are some weird intricacies and just things that seem off with these players in terms of their interactions, and I'm not really sure what that's all about. Like, I'm not going to try and speculate what was going on with JoJo yelling at Shaden and, you know, Shaden having that weird interview after. Like, I'm not going to try and pretend like I understand, you know, what was going on in terms of, you know, there. But on the Rift, everything's working out. And so, you know, it's hard for me to complain up until this point. But player of the game for me is going to go to JoJo Pune. You know, I don't want to spoil anything for the playoff primer, but you guys are an hour and 11, hour 12 into this LCS weekly recap. If you're watching this far, you probably, you know my opinions by this point. You probably watch a lot of my content. This might be the MVP sealer for JoJo. Like, this was a really damn good game against another really damn good player in Insanity who's had a really damn good split. Like, JoJo's just been fantastic. Being able to put him on things like Tristana that are just so powerful in the current meta and give so much agency to good mid laners, it really just shows you who the best players are. And JoJo is one of the best players, if not the best player in the entire league at the current moment. Just a ridiculously good game coming coming in from him. He really does play off the rest of this team incredibly well, but he elevates everyone on Evil Geniuses to be much more than what they are individually. And that's not to say they're bad pieces individually. Again, that's not the point that I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is that I think playing with JoJo makes everyone better because of just how good he is at the game and how much pressure he puts on the map. And so really good stuff from him. This was a phenomenal performance. And, you know, with that conversation surrounding the MVP, I really do think JoJo made a pretty solid argument to put himself right at the top of that list. In this one, I thought Shaden had a really good game on the Ivern. This was probably his best individual game, in my opinion, at least from top to bottom. Thought it was very consistent. Really liked the Kai'Sa Amumu, obviously. Amumu, kind of a FlyQuest pick. Really funny to see Ayla pull that out in the final game in particular. We've seen Spica play it so much over the course of the last two splits that, you know, seeing Ayla bring it out here is kind of funny. But Amumu's still actually a pretty solid support. I know we're not really seeing it anywhere, but it can definitely create. And while it's not as efficient as things like Nautilus or, you know, things like Rel, I still think Amumu can do a lot for your team and still can be relatively efficient like Ayla was in this game, especially if you're the better player, which he was. Unforgiven was very good on the Kai'Sa. Revenge was on Cassante, didn't really make any major errors, but he didn't need to. He was going into a Ken and he just had to neutralize that engage threat, and I thought he did that relatively well. Just a good game from Evil Geniuses. Really not a lot of negatives to say from them. And then for TSM on the other side, man, what happened to this team? And specifically, what happened to, like, everyone on this team? Because nobody had a particularly good week. It's not like one player was still stepping up and playing well and the rest just, you know, kind of fell apart and the team lost games because of it. I understand that their schedule was relatively hard. Outside of FlyQuest, they didn't really have, like, a super winnable game this week if they're not a top 3 team. You had Evil Geniuses and you had Cloud9, both of which are incredibly difficult games. And even FlyQuest, at their best, is a very difficult team to take down. But I would have liked to at least seen some of these games be relatively close, and it just didn't feel like they were. Dead of the game for me is again going to go to Wild Turtle. He had like a very shockingly bad week. I think he was the worst performing member of TSM across this week, and that's certainly not what I expected. I mean, you know, 2 kills off of being the kill leader, the all-time kill leader, and, you know, wasn't able to get them here, and so really, really funny. Hopefully he's going to be able to pick those up, you know, at some point, because Wild Turtle's an awesome player, has played the most games in LCS history, just an absolute North American League of Legends legend. That's a weird way to put it, but I guess that's basically how you have to say it. Just not a very good final week of the season for him. He definitely needs to step up in the playoffs and get back to that more consistent state that I think he was really good at over the course of the end of spring when he got subbed in, and then basically all of summer. Chime was actually really good on the recon, was engaging a lot and creating a lot for the team. Unfortunately, there just was basically no damage as follow-up on this team. Insanity was trying his best and was certainly trying to stay aggressive, but JoJo was just the better player in this game, which was kind of the case for Insanity in a lot of the games that he played this week. He tried, but was just getting a little bit outskilled, and JoJo is definitely not someone that you're going to be frustrated being outskilled by, arguably. Behind Berserker, you know, even with Berserker, is the most mechanically talented player in the region. Blabber's up there as well, but you know, Hanser has not really been a positive for this team, although I do think his negatives get blown way out of proportion, just like all players who, you know, just instantly get hated by social media do, right? Like, once social media, especially like Reddit, turns on you, like, it doesn't really matter. You can't really have, like, neutral games. Your neutral games turn into bad games, and your good games turn into neutral games, if that makes sense. Everything is just immediately taken down a notch because public perception of you has changed so much. This was a neutral game for Hanser, even though everybody's gonna say, oh my god, he was so useless, his engages were so bad, yada, 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 right? Like, if Hanser wasn't a player that everybody already decided that they hated, like, nobody would talk about this performance. That's just kind of the reality of the situation, but he was whatever. Boogie was whatever in this game. It was mostly Wild Turtle that was giving so many advantages over to the side of Evil Geniuses that it was kind of disappointing. The Zeri pick really did not work out. We're seeing why that champion has kind of fallen out of favor in the meta, but for TSM, I mean, you got to figure out what the problem is, because you don't want to be going into playoffs with this kind of momentum. This is a team that definitely needs to be on their A game, or else they could be a pretty easy out in the playoffs as well. As much as I have liked this team at points in the regular season, they're certainly not guaranteed anything, especially if they're going to play like this. And then for Evil Geniuses, this team is back. I overreacted by putting them down to number 5 after the end of week 5. I do think that this still is one of the top 3 teams in the league and should be a team that, at the very least, is in contention to go to Worlds. I really like, you know, what everybody on this team has been able to do, but JoJo has been absolutely lighting the world on fire, and this game was just another example of that. Then moving on to game number 3 now, and we had a pretty interesting one here, but no real surprise. We had 100 Thieves taking on Golden Guardians, And Golden Guardians is going to be able to pick up that win, and again, it's kind of an important one because with that win, they have now guaranteed themselves at the very least a tiebreaker for first place in the LCS this regular season, which is massive for this team and for this org. I've already talked about why, but I mean, they've completely deserved it. Their players are playing at an incredibly high level, and nothing has really changed, you know, since the last game that we talked about at the end of day number 2. They're still really, really good. Everybody's performing at a high level, and I would argue that in this game, everybody continued to perform at a high level. Really, what I want to highlight is their cohesion together. Obviously, individually, all of these players are incredibly talented. Licorice is, you know, one of the best top laners in the league. River and Gory are a great duo, and Stixay and Huhi have really re-emerged, mechanically speaking, as some of the best players in the region, but like, they work together incredibly well in that same vein. They are a very, very nice, cohesive unit. And that's not really something that we're saying about a lot of the other top teams in the LCS at the current moment. A lot of the other teams are just like, they have a couple of good players, and when those players step up, they're able to dominate. You know, we've talked about Evil Geniuses as much as I love them, and as much as I love JoJo. When JoJo has bad games, there really isn't a lot of avenues for them to be able to play off of that kind of pressure, and honestly, Cloud9 can sometimes fall into that trap. They can sometimes just be the team that wants to skill check their opponents, out-mechanic them, be able to generate leads on their own, and just kind of translate that into wins, and when it's not quite as easy to do that, sometimes they can fall into a trap. Golden Guardians, I don't think, has that problem at the current moment. I think they have very good macro, and I think they play off of each other incredibly well. They're all very aggressive players. They're kind of the antithesis of Dignitas, if you will, in the fact that they all like to go, 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 and they all work in that way. There was a play towards the back half of this game where River just pulls the trigger on a full engage on Vi, and everybody else on the team just follows him instantly, and even though it looks like a fight that generally would be bad for Golden Guardians, they almost instantly are able to win it because they're able to kill the Zeri and just kind of win the game off of that. And it's really, really important to have that kind of synergy and to have that kind of cohesion, to have that ability to play off of each other in that way. It doesn't even really matter what the play is so long as you make it together. I really do believe that for the most part, that ends up being the case. We've seen a lot of specifically LCK teams in the past follow that philosophy. Sometimes they can be a little bit more passive with those plays, but oftentimes they're all on the same page. They're all making it together, and that's really what I think drives plays like that home, and I think Golden Guardians definitely has a little bit of that in them. Player of the game for me is going to go to Gory in the mid lane on this Ahri. He's been so good over the course of this split. I do think he's had a couple more bad games than people are giving him credit for. I've been seeing some conversation around him being like MVP and like first team All-Pro. It might be a tad bit rich for me, but still a really, really good player nonetheless. Somebody who is maybe the best or the second best talent-wise mid laner in North America, and I think that that's pretty easy to see, especially when he gets to play off of the rest of this team. But the rest of this team was also really good. Stixay and Huhi had a phenomenal game. Huhi in particular on that Leona, a lot of really good engages. Stixay is just so consistent at being able to deal damage basically no matter what champion he's on. Licorice and River had some moments that were good. River in particular, like I said, pulling the trigger on the late game engage that ends up winning Golden Guardians the game. But this is a unit more than it is individual players, and that was no more exemplified than in this game. And then for 100 Thieves on the other side, yeah, they're who we thought they were. 7-11 as the final record. That is not exactly, I think, what they were looking for at the beginning of the split. They probably saw themselves as a team with top 4 upside. I don't think they saw themselves as the team that is potentially sneaking into playoffs as the final seed. I really didn't think that was on the bingo card, but there are a lot of things on this team that just are not working. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Quid in the mid lane. I'm really low on Quid, and I hate to say it, like, this is another good take from me, and I know that a lot of people are tired of hearing me say that, or at least I feel like I say it way too much, but I feel like, especially this year, I've just had so many takes that have aged well, and I'm patting myself on the back for it, and Quid has definitely been one of them as a player that I was like, yeah, you know, he was a good player, but really what he was doing for Genji Academy, and I think I said this, or Genji Challengers, I should say, and I think I said this in the spring primer video, or the summer primer video for 100 Thieves, is he was given everything, every single resource on that team. That team was bad, and he was the only good player on it, quite frankly, and he was given every resource because of it, and I think he looked really good in that zone, but when he wasn't able to play from ahead, when he wasn't given a ton of resources, he really wasn't all that efficient. That's what I saw in the tape. I knew he had the mechanics, but it really wasn't a completed product when he was coming over to 100 Thieves, and they really needed that, and he has not been that for them. He has been one of the weaker mid laners in all of the LCS, and I don't even think that's really all that debatable. He's just not been good. That ultimate towards the back half of this game where he just insta-ults Leona on top of his Zeri, and his Zeri instantly dies, it just encapsulates everything that 100 Thieves has been going through this entire split. Doublelift had an amazing game on this Zeri pick that I just don't think is strong, but it wasn't enough to be able to carry this team over the top. Closer was okay. on the Sejuani as well. He's had a couple of good games towards the back half of the season, which again is pretty in line with his typical performances, but Busio was kind of bad in this game. Someday was kind of bad in this game. 100 Thieves just isn't very good right now. I don't know what the fix is. Doublelift is really the only player that has been playing remotely well throughout this split. I think Busio's had some good moments as well, but it's really just this bot lane that they can rely on to win games, and even then, I don't think it's going to be a ton. This could be a very, very quick exit for an organization that I think had much bigger aspirations this split. And then for Golden Guardians on the other side, I do not think they're going to have a quick exit in the playoffs. They've guaranteed themselves at the very least a bye in the first round, which is massive. Being able to get that bye in the first round and immediately be able to get slotted into that second round is nice. And then, of course, there's a potential that they'll get to choose which side of the bracket they want to be on in the first place. So good stuff overall for Golden Guardians, and there's a chance they only continue to get better as the year goes on. And then moving on to game number 4 now of the final day, and it was a matchup between Team Liquid and Dignitas, and Team Liquid is able to get the job done as they absolutely should, and they're going to finish their season off with 10 wins. They do get to that double-digit marker, which I really do think is the goal for a lot of these teams, is to hit, 10, obviously. 500 is really, really good, but being above 500 is even better, and Team Liquid can officially say they will end this split above 500, which is significantly better than what they were able to do last split when they ended it below 500. So good stuff from TL. Clearly, they have gotten better over the course of this year, and I think anybody who has watched their games would definitely agree with that. Unfortunately for Dignitas, it means no win here, no getting to 8 wins, which does mean we are guaranteed at least one tiebreaker because Dignitas and 100 Thieves do have the same record to end the split. So they're going to have to play a tiebreaker to find out how exactly that ends up working out, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Let's talk about Team Liquid. This team is really good at being able to capitalize on teams that just aren't as good as they are, and that's kind of the case with Dignitas here. Player of the game for me is going to go to APA in the mid lane. Really, really good game from him. Again, signature at this point, Ziggs pick in the mid lane. I think that's what people are going to associate with him in the LCS, obviously. He's got like the Aurelian soul that we all know about for people who have watched him for a while, but I think the Ziggs pick is certainly what has caught people's eyes in summer of 2023, just kind of the meta to be able to pull stuff like that out, and he's been able to play it at a very high level. We've seen Ziggs kind of thrown around there, mostly as a bot laner in a lot of these comps that have a Tristana or a Jace or something a little bit more AD heavy without wanting to spend like a pick on Maokai or something else in the jungle. And so, we've seen that Ziggs kind of get flexed, but, in the LCS in particular, we're seeing it quite a bit more in the mid lane than you would traditionally see in a lot of different regions. And I think APA is a big reason for that. He does pilot it at a very high level. And like I said, we all thought that there was going to be some issues, I think, when it came to communication, when APA came into the team, him being the only person on the team who can't speak Korean, and as far as we know, this team is pretty primarily and exclusively speaking Korean, but it doesn't really seem to have mattered. APA has significantly better chemistry with Pioshik than Harry ever did, and I'm not saying Harry's a bad player. The dude is absolutely massacring the NACL right now. If he played the entire split there, he would have been MVP, just like I said for APA, and so it certainly wasn't an individual talent thing for Harry. It really was just, I think he didn't necessarily fit on this team as kind of that secondary piece. I think they needed someone to step in and be more of a main carry, someone that they could put a lot of resources into, and I think APA has pretty actively been that for this team. Pioshik has looked a lot better since APA came in. I think he's looked a lot more aggressive. He's having a lot more fun playing the game again, and that's always been when Pioshik is at his best, when he's relaxed and when he's able to go out there and just play the style that he wants to play, when he knows his team is going to be able to back him up. That's what he was doing at Worlds, and I think he did a really good job of that here. Summit was pretty solid on Ornn, which is not a typical Summit pick, but I do think he pulled it off, and Jan was spectacular on Tristana. Love the double flex here for Team Liquid. They're one of the few teams that I think is willing to send Tristana into the bot lane super regularly. Not only have we seen Jan do it multiple times, but we've seen Arrow do it down in NACL in that same vein, and so this is just an organization that I do think practices playing both matchups of the Ziggs and Tristana in both of those lanes, and I think it very much paid off in a matchup like this, where you do kind of want the Tristana going into something like the Kai'Sa instead of the Azir, and so good stuff overall from Team Liquid, just a really good game. And then for Dignitas, it's an unfortunate way to end your split, but again, like 7-11, I think is honestly better than this team has played over the last couple of weeks. I have lost pretty much all the confidence that this team gained on me over the course of this split because I really just do not believe in this construction of the roster, and I think if they go into playoffs playing the way that they have over the last 2.5 weeks, I think they're going to get absolutely demolished. And, even if this game wasn't an absolute demolition, I just don't think this team was ever really in it, right? They just kind of rolled over and died. Jensen Renekton had so much gold on the Azir, and yet it never really felt like they were ever in position to win a team fight, which is crazy. Everybody else was just kind of behind. Santorin was kind of in the game on the Ivern. You know, he was doing what Ivern is supposed to do, but everybody else not so much. Tomo didn't really make mistakes, but also really wasn't a big factor in this game. Rich was mostly just kind of there on Renekton, and man, dud of the game for me is again gonna go to Poom. And I don't mean to be like a big negative Nancy on this channel. I really hate bringing down players because I just don't think it really adds anything to the conversation, but I think it's worth noting that Poom has been probably the worst player in the LCS over the past 2 weeks. He just has not been very good. Ever since he subbed in, he has not clicked with this team. It's not been a positive. Honestly, if I'm the management of Dignitas, I'm subbing Diamond back in for playoffs because I think Poom lowers your ceiling by a considerable margin. He certainly has lowered your floor. This team has been significantly worse in the short term with him in there, and I just don't think it's going to get better, like, before it gets worse, and that was kind of the case again here. He's been just not very good for this Dignitas team. Again, hopefully he can turn something around, because mechanically speaking, he's shown some interesting things in the past. I've never been super sold on him. I always thought he was a little bit over-aggressive on CLG. I, complained about him a bit last year, being out of position and not necessarily playing with Luger as much as he should have, but, Tomo is someone who is going to follow up on some of those aggressive plays. It feels like his play style has changed a ton. He's been much more passive on this Dignitas team, and I think it's really hurt them a lot, and so I don't really have a lot of faith in Dig. I think this game was a good example of why. I think they kind of proved me, I don't want to say right, but proved a lot of my fears true in this one. And then for Liquid, they're a good team. I don't know if they're a great team. I don't know if they're a Worlds team. I know their aspiration is definitely to be a Worlds team. Can they get there? Absolutely. Are they there right now? I have no idea. Maybe. The consistency certainly isn't, but I think their top-end games look like that. I think they just need to be able to pull stuff like this out more consistently against the best teams in the league. They absolutely can. It's just a matter of if. That's going to bring us to our final technical regular season game of 2023 here in the LCS. It's been a long ride to get here, but we have gotten here nonetheless. It is a matchup that I think a lot of us expected to be a battle of two of the top teams in the LCS coming down at the end of the season, but not quite the circumstance we ended up getting. We have a matchup between Cloud9 and FlyQuest. And Cloud9 is going to be able to pick up the win. Now, you would think, well, they're already 12-5, they're already locked into a playoff spot. This game doesn't actually matter all that much, right? Well, no, actually it mattered quite a bit. Cloud9 winning this really does affect something else, because we talked earlier about how we're going to get a tiebreaker between Dignitas and 100 Thieves for that 7 seed instead of the 8 seed. Not quite as influential, but now with Cloud9 being able to pick up the victory here, we are confirmed to get a tiebreaker for first place in the LCS between Cloud9 and Golden Guardians later on in the day. So excited to cover that, but in this game, I mean, this was a blowout from the side of Cloud9, and, we've always kind of wanted to see Cloud9 versus FlyQuest. That's kind of the matchup everybody's been most anticipating. Maybe not so much this split, but I think on paper, everybody really wanted to see how these two teams went head-to-head, and, the first time was very Cloud9 favored, the second time has now been very Cloud9 favored in that same vein. They just dominated. I'm going to talk about FlyQuest. I promise I will get to them, because I certainly have some thoughts that I want to go into, and I've already shared quite a bit of them in this video up until this point, but, the community, for me, can be a little bit frustrating sometimes, and I'll kind of explain why. But for Cloud9, really, really good win here. Obviously, you got to be able to win this to be able to get into that playoffs as the #1 seed, or at least to, give yourself the ability to play for that #1 seed, and you did that. Player of the game for me is going to go to Blabber in the jungle. Now, I'm not saying that he should win MVP, but Blabber's been pretty damn good this split, and I think he's almost flown under the radar because of just how flashy a couple of the other players in the league have been. I've seen a lot of names thrown around for MVP, whether it be, Jojo Pune or basically anybody on Golden Guardians, or, a couple of other players at different times, but, Blabber's right there with basically anybody for being the best player in the LCS, and how many times do we have to have this conversation before we call him the best player in LCS history? Like, at his peak, like, in terms of performance, is there really anybody who has ever dominated the league for as long as Blabber has dominated the league as successfully as he's done it? For 6 splits in a row, I think you can make an argument that he's just been the best player. Like, name another player who's been able to do that for that long, right? Like, Doublelift had a lot of really good splits, but really when you think of, like, the peak of Doublelift, at least for me, I'm thinking of, like, maybe a little bit of TSM, but really it's the Team Liquid days. That's like peak Doublelift. That's where he was, in my opinion, at his best, his most mechanically talented. That's his, like, era, and that was 4 splits, and that's great. 4 splits is great, but Blabber's been doing this for 6, and it's not looking like it's stopping anytime soon. He's going to go down, in my opinion, as the greatest LCS player of all time, and I think we're going to continue to just kind of look at him in reverence. He's just so ridiculously good. It's actually insane. The rest of this team is good as well. Fudge was really good on the Kennen. Sven had another really good game this time on the Rakan. Really liked his performance. Berserker was good on the Xayah. Didn't really have to do all that much this game, and that's kind of been the story of Berserker over the course of this split. Is really hasn't had to do a whole ton, but still has been really good when he's asked to do stuff. And Eminus was good as well. Was definitely the better mid laner. Cloud9 just kind of dominated, but a lot of it was on the back of that Sejuani, which was just so massive the entirety of that game. Blabber is so crazy good for Cloud9. And then for FlyQuest, I'm going to say it, I don't want to go on a full rant because I put out a tweet right before this section started. If you want to go check that out, go follow me on Twitter. The link to that's going to be in the description. I tweet about League of Legends, but I put out a big rant. It was like a 5-thread tweet or whatever, where I'm like, guys, we need to stop shitting on FlyQuest as an org. Like, I get it. I understand the idea that we want to cheer for the underdogs, and we want to boo the favorites, the people who spend money, the people who are supposed to win, and we want to see the people who aren't supposed to win. I get it. I understand that mentality. But to laugh at the demise of FlyQuest and to sit there and be like, it's good for the league that FlyQuest lost, no more imports, no more yada yada yada, right? Endemic NA talent, etc., right? I disagree with that mentality so much, because what essentially it boils down to, in my eyes, and obviously you can correct me in the comment section if you guys view it a different way, what it comes down to, in my eyes, is this idea that team tried, that's bad, right? Like, that's not what I want. That's not the outcome that I want here. I want teams to do what FlyQuest did. I want a team to sit down. I want somebody in an organization like Papa Smithy to be able to come in and say, I want to get the best team available. I want to make sure that we are a team that can, at our best, compete internationally. That has to be the goal. And that's what FlyQuest was supposed to be. And that's what I want our teams to be in North America. I don't want to continuously see teams that are good, that are budget rosters. I get it. I love Evil Geniuses as much as the next guy, but do I want to see a bunch of teams of Evil Geniuses instead of a team that I think genuinely could actually take down, some teams internationally? No, I would so much rather have more Cloud9s than Evil Geniuses, and I know that's maybe a controversial statement, but it really is where I fall. I want to see endemic talent be given an opportunity, and I'm not saying just import. That's not what I'm saying. Import does not always mean success, but paying money and spending the resources in order to get a good team, that's what I want to see. I want to see teams actively putting in effort. Do I want a bunch of TSMs in the league? No. That's why earlier I said I was frustrated that a team like TSM was doing better than FlyQuest, because TSM is an org that really didn't give a shit this year and was winning anyways, and that to me is frustrating, because the org should give a shit in order to stay in the league. I don't know. Maybe it's just my opinion. I get it. Like, I get not wanting being interested in FlyQuest's downfall because they weren't supposed to be this bad, but especially the comments surrounding players like Vikla. He had an awful split. There was no other way around it. The mental is completely boomed for him, and a lot of the mechanics I think have regressed as well, but I think a lot of that does come down to confidence. I've seen a lot of comments where it's like, I hope Vikla never gets a job again. And it's like, what are we doing? Where have we gone with this? That was something on Reddit that I think had like 500 upvotes. And it's like, how far disconnected are we from this if 500 people on Reddit are willing to say, this person doesn't deserve to ever get a starting position in his dream job again because he played pretty poorly for 3 months. Like, I don't understand. I don't get it. Vikla was Rookie of the Year in the LCK last year. And go back and watch his spring split. I get it. Recency bias is definitely there. And there's always been a little bit of a grudge against Vikla, I think, in general, because people wanted to hate FlyQuest. But he was really freaking good in spring. Like, he was really, really good. He was my first team all-pro mid laner. And I think at worst, he was like second or third team. It was on the list for sure. He was really, really good. He just did not play well in summer. Do you know how many players didn't? Jojo Pune was miserable in summer of last year. He was one of the worst mid laners in the entire league, and now he's MVP. You can get better. You can bounce back, and I'm tired of this narrative and this overreaction and this black and white thinking. Again, let me know down in the comments if I'm just viewing maybe like a small subsection of the LCS community, but I understand that the doomer jokes are funny and, oh, the LCS is dying trying, like, yada, yada, yada. Like, I understand that the narrative is entertaining and everybody on social media likes to recycle it. But at the end of the day, I think it's starting to bleed into how we see these players. And if we continue to treat, like, a lot of these orgs that do end up trying the way that we are, then we're just going to get a league of 10 teams that aren't actually trying and a league of 10 owners that aren't actually putting in any effort because there's been no, pushback from the community. There's been no feedback. And so that's my concern, and that's my worry, and it's why I'm frustrated with it. But Vic was done of the game. They played bad. Their season's over. I don't even really want to talk about this game because this game doesn't matter. I think that's the FlyQuest segment for this. But congratulations to Cloud9. This was a nice win, and we're going to see a little bit of them later on. Obviously, that tiebreaker, but they've confirmed themselves at the very least getting a bye in the first round, and nobody's really all surprised to see that coming. But now that we've covered every regular season game, it's time to quickly get into the tiebreakers. These aren't the most important tiebreakers in the entire world. You're not moving up or down in like a slot because of this. I mean, you are technically, but it's 7 and 8 and then 1 and 2. And so both are still in the same exact zone. You're grouped into 1, 2, and then 3, 4, and then 5, 6, and then 7, 8. And so you're not moving up or down in terms of like, oh, you might be in winner's bracket or you might be in loser's bracket immediately, or you might get a bye or you might not. It's just more so, giving yourself a little bit more flexibility in the teams that you end up facing in the next round. So important games, but I might go through them at least a little bit quicker just because I think the importance of each isn't going to be nearly as important as the regular season games. But let's go ahead and talk about it, kicking it off at first with our 7-8 matchup, our battle for 7th place here. We have a matchup between Dignitas and 100 Thieves. And Dignitas is going to be able to come out on top. 100 Thieves continuing to struggle quite a bit in this one, and Dignitas locking in that number 7 seed. That means the final seed entering the playoffs is 100 Thieves. They're lucky to be in it in the first place. If FlyQuest didn't shit the bed as much as they did, 100 Thieves very likely would be missing the playoffs at the moment, but they are in by gratuitous luck, and right now they're currently not making the most of it, at least in the tiebreaker to get their seeding. Not a great performance, but a good one from Dignitas, I would say overall. Just a relatively solid game from them. They were definitely the better team in this one. Player of the game, I think, could go to a variety of different players, but I'm going to give it to Rich in the top lane. He's just been really good for this team. He's easily the best player on Dignitas. I don't even think it's all that close. Jensen's had good moments, but really it's Rich. Like, Rich is the player that I think you're really trying to build around if you are this organization, and this Fiora game was really good. Got to play it into Cassante. Oftentimes that can be kind of a wishy-washy matchup for both sides, kind of depending on who's playing each matchup. But I thought Rich did a really good job going into Someday here, who really wasn't all that bad. I just think Rich was pretty good. Jensen and Tomo were also really, really good for Dignitas, so the amount of damage that Jace does is just absurd. That champion's in a crazy place. And you could say the same thing for Kaisa, especially when you've got them on the same team. The like artillery barrage that you have to deal with in the late game from, Jace Shock Blast and Kaisa W. It's like absurd what you actually have to go through. But I think Poom actually had a really good game here. Poom has now won 2 games on Dignitas, and both are against 100 Thieves. Not sure if that says anything in particular, but it's certainly something worth noting. This is probably not the comp you would want to play Blitzcrank into. Cassante, Ivor, Nautilus, like Spell Shield, Sivir, and then Tristana, who's never in range. Like, not necessarily the best Blitzcrank comp, but honestly, he played a pretty good game here. This looked a lot more comfortable for him than anything that happened in the last couple of games, so that's good. Santorin was good on the Maokai, was somehow the more proactive jungler. You probably have the 2 least proactive junglers in the league in this game. Not necessarily a good thing, but Dignitas being able to pick up the win and get that 7 seed is good. 100 Thieves are just a mess right now. There really is no other way to put it. Hopefully this team can figure it out because they're just not fun to watch at the current moment. Dud of the game is going to go to Quid. He's really been bad for this team. Like, I've tried to sugarcoat it. I've tried to, if those of you who follow the channel know, I really do tend to give a positive spin, or at least I try to give a positive spin on things. I try to avoid saying, like, this player's been awful, right? Even for closer, I've said, like, he's had a poor split, or he's a little bit cold right now, or these are the things he can work on. I really try and stay away from, like, this guy's just not playing at a good level. I don't think Quid's playing at a very good level. Like, it's very not good how consistently he's on the wrong page from the rest of his team, and I don't know if that's his fault. Maybe there's major communication issues, maybe his English isn't as good as maybe you would hope. Whatever the issue is, it's just clearly not going to resolve itself, and I think that's going to be a weakness for them. Closer continues to get out jungled. Some days not necessarily been a positive on the top side. That leaves 1 lane for you to be able to win through, and you draft for it. You drafted Sivir. You can play a Sivir comp here. You can scale up into the late game and try to win through that, but this team is like allergic to peeling for double lift, and and so they're not actually going to be able to do it in the late game. I just don't know how 100 Thieves is going to win games towards the back half of this split against teams that they're not going to be able to just completely skill check. So, definitely up in the air, but for Dignitas, this is a nice win, and I think they're going to be happy to move in to that first round with at least some confidence that they're not the weakest team in the playoffs. And then we get into the tiebreaker that I think a lot more people were interested in, the tiebreaker for first place here in the LCS, and it was a matchup between Cloud9 and Golden Guardians, and the winner was Cloud9. They are able to take it a 25-minute relative stomp, I would say, in this game. They were clearly better, and this really is the Cloud9 that we know and love. I hate to compare it to a series that some of you might be familiar with, but this really does feel like the JD Gaming, Billy Gaming of the LCS, where it's like, man, Golden Guardians look so good and they're beating everybody else and they look so consistent, but they can never get over the best team in the league, or at least they haven't up until this point, that being Cloud9, who just looks unstoppable when the games matter the most. I think lucky, I'll say this, lucky for Huhi, I don't count tiebreaker games for MVP and All-Pro voting. I don't think that counts. It's a regular season award, and tiebreakers to me are not regular season games. It gives more opportunities to players that, it's just some players than others is really the way to put it. Unlucky for Blabber, though, because what a Kindred game. Oh my goodness gracious, what a Kindred game from him. We know he's been good at this champion for a crazy long time. I know I've probably said this split already. I think I said it like 2 weeks ago. But when Blabber was coming up in 2018, I specifically remember, Kindred and Gragas. Those were the two picks that he was really going towards. I still mostly associate him with the Gragas. I still think it's his best champion when it is in meta, but Kindred's right up there with it, and obviously there were quite a few others that he started to make a name for himself on, the Olaf being paramount among them, but Kindred's just so crazy in the hands of Blabber. He's so willing to skirmish in the early game, and he knows the limits of that champion so well. I know we've got a lot of Kindred players in the LCS with, someone like Kenvi coming up and being mostly a Kindred player. Pioshik, obviously, being a Kindred player, but Blabber, I think, is right in there with them for, someone who I think is kind of associated with that champion in the jungle, but a great game from Berserker as well in the bot lane. Ashe is a pick that I've complained about on this channel before. Not when you've got Kindred. That no longer becomes as much of an issue, because Kindred can keep up with a lot of that damage, can do a lot of what Ashe is supposed to set up. Ashe is going to set up Kindred well, is the point I'm trying to make, and Berserker makes Ashe look like the most broken champion in the world. It's just how good he is. Sven was phenomenal on Milio. Still shocked to see the prio of this champion drop so much. I think it's still really good. I get it, engage supports are really good right now, and they're so much more fun to play than enchanters, but I've said it in multiple other videos. I think enchanters are incredibly slept on at the current moment, most specifically Milio, who I just think is still one of the scariest things to play into in the meta. Eminus was really good, Fudge was really good. Cloud9 dominated this game. They won every single lane, and they closed it out relatively efficiently. This was a pretty clear C9 win. And by Factory, that's a pretty clear GG loss, if you will. Not a great series from the bot lane. Stixxay and Huhi really got outclassed in this one. Stixxay had no pressure, was doing no damage on the Kai'Sa champion he's done relatively well on in the past, and this was probably Huhi's worst game of the split. He's had a couple up and down moments in the past, but this was the only time where it really felt like none of the plays that he went for worked at any point. He was just completely useless across this entire game. Again, not going to count towards MVP and All-Pro voting, but worth noting that, this is something that we can watch out for potentially later on in the playoffs if these two teams do end up facing each other. I thought Gory was relatively okay on the Jace. He was keeping up with Eminus for most of this game, but, that's Jace's job, is to be able to keep up in the early game. Every other lane lost, so the Gwen had no pressure in the counter pick matchup, which is not good. River was not good on the Rel. You need to be the better jungler in order to pilot that, and the Kindred got way too much prio in the early game. And like I already said, bot lane was very in favor of Cloud9, and so really no pressure on the bot side of the map to be able to stack objectives either. Just a poor game for Golden Guardians. You got to be able to put it behind you, though. You're going into the playoffs now as the 2 seed. That's still really good. You still get that first round bye. You're just not going to be able to pick the side. That's really all that there is. You got to be able to face whoever Cloud9 gives you, and Cloud9, congratulations. You now get to pick which side of the bracket you want to be on. You basically get to pick which grouping of teams you want to end up facing, and it's definitely going to be an interesting decision, but at least with the way that this team is currently performing, I have a lot of faith that they're going to go up against basically anybody and be able to take them down. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS Week 6 overview and analysis of all 17 games, including the tiebreakers. Up on the screen now, you are going to see the final LCS standings after the final week of the regular season. You'll notice something a little bit different. No power rankings this week, and that is because I am going to be putting out a playoff primer video where I go over my full bracket predictions, and I don't want to spoil anything for that video here, and so you're going to have to wait for that video. It should be coming out early on next week, and so be excited and be on the lookout for that one. I'm going to be going over all of these teams in depth, how they played throughout the regular season, and give my thoughts on what could potentially be happening in the playoffs. Of course, full bracket predictions in that video. I'll also have all my award picks. That means MVP, that means Rookie of the Split, and that means all 3 All-Pro teams. And so if you're excited about that, stick around, hit the subscribe button, and hit that bell. Obviously, we don't only post about the LCS here, we post about all of the major regions on this channel, all 4 of them, as well as the NACL, and with playoffs kicking up basically everywhere. LPL has already started, NACL started today. There's so many good things. LEC is about to be out of group stage, and so many regions kicking in. If you want coverage on all that, this is the place for it. That's another reason to hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you'll be notified when those videos go live. And of course, if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content and helps get this video out to a lot more people. But I got to do my outros a little bit first. Up on the screen, obviously, you're seeing the standings. Colors are just separating the different places in the playoffs. So C9 and Golden Guardians, of course, getting buys in that first round, and so they are highlighted themselves. EG is going to be facing TSM, Team Liquid going to be facing Energy in the winners bracket, and then Dignitas and 100 Thieves going to be starting in lower bracket as soon as the playoffs starts. But FlyQuest and Immortals are the first 2 teams that are eliminated, not only from Summer Split, but from 2023, from Worlds contention, just in general. Unfortunate for them, but time to talk about Player of the Week and Dud of the Week in week number 6. My Player of the Week, pretty shockingly to a lot of people, is actually going to go to a player on an eliminated team. My Player of the Week in week 6 is going to go to Impact, the top laner for FlyQuest. I really do believe he was the most impactful, pun completely intended, player in the entire LCS this week. The 2 wins that FlyQuest got were off the back of Impact playing at a very high level, and honestly, it was either him or Blabber, and Blabber was in a tiebreaker, and so I ended up going with Impact, and I thought he was really, really good and really deserved it. Blabber obviously deserves it as well, but I wanted to give some shout out to FlyQuest because I actually do think they played relatively well this week, and they just couldn't get the job done against the best team in the entire league, which I don't necessarily blame them for. So Impact's going to be my Player of the Week, and my Dud of the Week, pretty unsurprisingly, is going to go to Poom, the support for Dignitas. It felt like he was pretty consistently the worst player in the LCS this week. Basically, in every single game that they played, he was not particularly positive. The Blitzcrank game was interesting, but again, that was a tiebreaker, which I'm not counting towards this. That wasn't week 6. I don't count it towards week 6, and so Poom's going to be getting that. I think the other player was Wild Turtle, that I definitely considered a pretty miserable week from him, and I think, them going 0-3 definitely lends more credence to giving it over to Wild Turtle, but for me, Dud of the Week in week 6 was Poom, and Player of the Week was Impact. But again, that's going to be it. I really do hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope to see you back here soon for that LCS playoff primer. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.